Chapter 1 Springtime in Lightwood was, in many people's opinions, the best time of the year. This was particularly evident in the far reach, where the infusion of magic in the air along with the fresh breath of the new year brought out the finest blooms and trees in all Storialize. As flowers danced and birds overhead darted and swooped, the trees, gnarled, old giants and fresh, young saplings stretched out their arms to the pale, yellow sun shining in the sky above them. As Vanessa stepped out of the stables, shielding her eyes with one hand and leading her horse, Lynn, with the other, she could have sworn it had increased its brilliance tenfold in the few minutes she had been inside. She did not shrink from its heated light, fearful for her complexion like so many female novices were, but spread out her arms wide so her body could soak up as much sun as it wanted. After a little while, she gathered the reins up in her fist and clicked her tongue at Lynn, who moved forward so her mistress had only to cling to the saddle and pull herself up. Vanessa clicked again, twice this time, and Lynn immediately broke into a trot. They made a striking pair as they rode through the grounds in the direction of the healer's quarters, the small girl with her long silken black curls bouncing around her face, sitting confidently atop the magnificent brown mare who placed her hooves with the precision and accuracy of a thoroughbred. Vanessa gently nudged the horse's flanks. Lynn obediently changed the trot to a canter and then, when she felt Vanessa ram the stirrups into her side, broke into a full gallop. Vanessa's long hair streamed out behind her, rippling like a black waterfall. The mare's tug on the reins brought Lynn to a halt as they arrived at the main door of the healer's quarters. To her delight, Vanessa saw a familiar green-robed figure exit the building. They locked eyes. "Lady Uriel!" Vanessa exclaimed. The healer smiled back at her. "Good morning, Vanessa. You look pretty well rested today. As opposed to me." Uriel gestured to the shadows beneath her eyes. Vanessa grimaced in sympathy. "Couldn't you have healed the sleeplessness away?" she asked. "Yes, I could," Uriel replied. "But I prefer real sleep as a remedy. And anyway, I'm completely drained after last night. I can't even make a globe light at the moment." "Is my mother still there?" Vanessa asked, referring to the hospital that had been set up in the slums, commandeered by Ilya. Uriel had come there when she was 15 and magical potential had been found. Facing opposition from a steadily decreasing faction of snobbish magicians, she had immediately joined the far reach. "Yes," said Uriel now. "None of us can wait till Lord Kane has healed, what with the number of dwells coming in every day. But you know broken bones. They hate being rushed." "I don't think Mama minds," said Vanessa. "She gets to help more dwells this way. Though she did say, we'd better think about building another slum hospital soon." "That would be a welcome relief," muttered Uriel. She attempted to hide a yawn behind her hand but Vanessa wasn't fooled. "Well, I'd better get going, my lady. I only came this way because I was hoping my mother would be back. Good morning." "Goodbye, Vanessa," answered Uriel. "Am I right in thinking that you're going to meet that thief friend of yours in the slums again?" "Landon, yes," smiled Vanessa. "And he's not a thief." "Not yet," said Uriel. "Give him time. And I think your mother will have left the hospital by now, so you should take that route if you want to see her." "Thanks, I will," called Vanessa as she turned Lynn around and galloped out of the far reach grounds into the city. Outside the north quarter gates she slowed as she came in sight of the hospital which had been established by her mother 13 years ago, just a few months before Vanessa's birth. As she had hoped, she soon spotted a ring composed of the assorted red, purple and green robes of the magicians escorting her mother, a slight figure in black in their midst. Ilya's head snapped up as she heard the horse's feet approach. A welcoming smile lit up her features when she saw the rider. "Vanessa," she said warmly. "Mama," Vanessa replied as she nimbly dismounted and walked through the throng of magicians around her mother who parted to give her space. "Where are you going?" asked Ilya. "I gave you those history books to read because I thought you were going to stay at home today." "I was," said Vanessa. "But after breakfast I got a message from Landon. It sounded pretty urgent since he wanted me to come right away. I came looking for you to get permission, Mama," "How long will it take?" asked Ilya. "About an hour." "All right then," said Ilya. "You can go, but hurry." "I will." "Thanks, Mama," said Vanessa, giving her mother's hand a squeeze before going back to Lynn. As she rode away, she glanced back over her shoulder. The magicians had resumed walking. Ilya was gazing over her shoulder at Vanessa. Vanessa thought she could make out tiny worry lines on her mother's brow. She didn't have any time to think about it, however, for at that moment she had to steer Lynn away from a group of children kicking a ball around. 5 minutes later they cantered to a stop outside a boho in the better part of the slums. The sign giving its name, the Merry Magician, creaked lustily in the wind as Vanessa jumped off Lynn and signaled to a passing stable boy who immediately took the reins and led Lynn off to a stall. Vanessa entered the building and looked around for an empty table. She spotted one in a corner and made toward it, pausing to grab a mug of ball from a waitress's tray. As the woman started to protest, Vanessa took a step forward so a beam of sunlight coming into the dimmed outhouse lit up her face. The waitress stopped her tirade and gulped. She stepped back hastily as Vanessa advanced past her to the table. During the encounter, a boy in his late teens had grabbed a chair at it and made no attempt to move as Vanessa approached. Then he looked up into her face and his own turned stark white and he made a choking noise at the back of his throat. He hurriedly scrambled to his feet and scuttled away like a frightened crab. Vanessa smiled as she sat down in the vacated seat. Being friends with a thief's son certainly had its advantages, she thought as she tossed a coin toward the waitress as payment for the ball. The man who had ordered it on the first place had made no complaint. Speaking of which, Vanessa frowned as she scanned the late morning crowds for Landon's face and did not see it. A hand touching her shoulder made her start and she nearly slopped ball over herself as she spun around. When she saw the hand's owner she felt her face break into a smile. "About time you showed up," she said nonchalantly as Landon sat down in the chair opposite her and blinked his boots up on the table. None of the waiters or the barman complained. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that Landon's father Waylon was head of the thieves in that area as well as other parts of the slums. The thief was known to be very disagreeable to anyone who crossed him or any of his kin, which included Landon, Vanessa and Ilya, whom Wanda had once loved and was still good friends with, although they hardly ever saw each other. Landon shrugged. "Not my fault. Father kept me back for something." "You're the one who wanted the meeting," Vanessa reminded him. "And Mama wants me back in an hour, so hurry up with it." "You told her it would take just an hour?" gaped Landon. Vanessa blinked. "Sure, I thought it would." "But Gus," said Landon, "it's gonna take at least 2. "Why?" asked Vanessa. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know how to explain it," said Landon. "Wanda'll be able to do it better." "Come on, Landon." "What?" Vanessa began. That was all she had time to say before Landon took her hand and tugged her through the crowd of dirty, unwashed bodies and stale, musty air to the large, busy but open street outside, where he let go of her hand, to her slight irritation. "We're going to meet Dalton?" she asked. "Yeah," said Landon. "You'll see why when we get there." He started off at a brisk walk and she had no option but to follow. They walked for about 10 minutes through the darker back alleys, taking a few shortcuts over tin roofs under which the occupants were too busy and tired to protest. The houses, the streets and the people became smaller, smellier and dingier as they progressed further into the slums. The lanes turned into muddy paths and garbage lined them as hedges did the paths in the far reach. Finally, they stopped by a house into whose low wall a grill had been set. Landon pushed it open with his foot and they clambered down onto the Thieves' Road. It was long and dark, the only illumination coming from a torch set into the wall right next to a separate passage branching away in another direction. As they stepped forward, a shadow seemed to detach itself from the walls and came to stand beside them. Vanessa stiffened in surprise, then relaxed. She recognized the large man as Yan, Waylon's bodyguard. Though he seemed to spend more time these days keeping an eye on Landon. "Landon," grunted Yan in his deep, low voice. "Hurry up. Your Da says he doesn't have all day." "You know that's a lie, Yan," said Landon. And anyway, Vanessa's not used to coming here the usual way, so we had to take the long cut." "Tell that to your father, not me," replied Jan as he led them down the road to the side passage. Landon shook his head as they turned down it. "Dwells these days," he said to Vanessa. "Don't know anything about showing respect. I dare you to find a single urchin in our pay who won't backcat if he got the chance." "Well, you definitely give them plenty," she replied. He narrowed his eyes at her. "What's that mean?" he demanded. She rolled her eyes, hiding a snigger at the same time. "Never mind," she said, speeding up to walk beside Jan, who was so vast he barely left any space between himself and the wall for her to squeeze into. They proceeded down the passageway at the bottom of the stairs for some time. Suddenly, Jan stopped in front of a stretch of brick wall which seemed no different from the others. He reached out and tapped a nondescript brick. It gave way, along with about 20 others, revealing yet another passage behind it. At the far end was a door with 2 torches in brackets burning on either side of it. Jan stepped aside as first Landon, then Vanessa stepped through the gap in the wall before following them inside. On the other side he worked a lever which used some kind of mechanism to noiselessly, if shakily, slide the bricks back to their original position. Vanessa shifted her gaze from the moving wall to the door which Landon had reached and was rapping on smartly. A panel near the top slid aside and a pair of dark eyes glared out. When they saw Landon, the panel slid back and the door swung open, not revealing the person behind it. Vanessa followed Landon into a little room, unfurnished except for a table and chair, and shivered. Despite the heat of the sun on the streets above, the room was quite cold. Landon turned to her. "Sorry, Vess," he said apologetically. "You'll have to wait here, just in case Dalton's got someone with him." "I don't mind, Landon," she replied. "Won't be long," he promised. "Yeah, and we'll be outside if you want anything." He exited through the door at the other end. Vanessa turned around and started with surprise. She had forgotten about the door opener. He stood in front of her now, surveying her with a beady eye. "Is there anything you want?" he asked. "No," she replied. The man gave her a cursory nod, then turned and walked out the door, pulling it shut behind him. Vanessa heard him talking to Jan as she sat down in the chair and tilted it back. She noticed a drawer in the desk. It was slightly ajar. She hadn't even known the desk had a drawer. The desk belonged to Landon and Vanessa knew he wouldn't mind if she looked inside, as he kept anything important in his rooms. She tugged it open and picked up a blank piece of paper. Turning it over, she was startled to see a very familiar face looking back at her. But Landon looked much older in this picture and her puzzlement turned to bewilderment. He was standing next to a young woman Vanessa had never seen before and the woman was holding a beaming baby in her arms. The baby had thick black hair and Landon's black eyes. In a flash, Vanessa realized that the baby was Landon and the parents smiling over him were his real parents, Waylon's half-brother and his wife who had tragically drowned in the Karoli River 12 years before. Wanda had immediately taken in his infant orphan nephew and raised him as his own son, changing his name to Landon. Vanessa had met Landon, who was a year younger than her, when she was 4. She had found Landon too much of a mouthful and had called him Landon instead. The nickname stuck. The door opened that Landon had gone through. Waylon stepped into the room. His skin was pale and there were dark circles under his eyes. His hair stuck up in all directions and there was a dark shadow of stubble on his chin. A thin layer of dirt covered his clothes. He looked as if he hadn't slept at all for the past 24 hours. He walked toward the table, Landon right behind him. Vanessa got up and moved to the other side of the table. Wanda took the chair as Landon called in a man who was holding 2 more. He set them down, bobbed his head at Wanda and left the room. Wanda looked at Vanessa and wordlessly gestured at one of the chairs. She took it as Landon sat down in the other. "So," said Vanessa, "what was it you asked me here for, Landon?" "It was Dalton's idea," said Landon. "Ask him." Wanda leaned forward. "I'll get straight to the point," he said briskly. We put a tag on a foreign merchant who unwisely threatened a shop owner in our pay. One of our messengers paid him a visit and brought away several valuable-looking items. 2 of them were these. Out of one of his vest coat pockets he slipped out 2 objects. One was a leather-bound book, handsome but unremarkable. It was the other object that captivated Vanessa and drew out a gasp of surprise from her. It was a long, gleaming knife whose hilt was inlaid with so many precious stones it seemed to glow with all the colors of the rainbow, plus countless others. It was beautiful. She reached out and picked it up, gingerly fingering the hilt. She turned it over. Her finger accidentally touched the blade. She felt a small but sharp pain as the metal cut through her skin. Even as she dropped the knife, Wanda's hand flashed seemingly out of nowhere and caught it by the hilt. Landon grasped her wrist and turned her hand over. The cut was on the tip of her index finger. It was barely visible, but a tiny drop of blood oozed out and ran down the finger. Vanessa pulled her hand out of Landon's grip and bit down on it, sucking the wound. Wanda set the knife down and looked at her. "You want to be careful with those," he said. "Very sharp. They have to be, because of the work they're used for." "Which is?" Landon prompted. Wanda frowned at him, then said, "Shadow magic." Landon, who had been tilting his chair back, let it land on all 4 legs with a thud. Vanessa used her feet to hastily push herself and her chair away from the table. "Shadow magic?" she repeated. "How come a foreign merchant had it? Doesn't he know what it is?" "He doesn't," answered Wanda. "In Foria, only magicians know the ways and tools of their art, so only one of them could have recognized it. Apparently, the merchant bought it years ago from a man who refused to say who he was. The man just took the money, not much by our standards, and practically ran away. The merchant kept it all this while because he wanted to be sure of getting a good price for it before selling it. He kept it until one day he got a golden opportunity to travel to Shadoya to sell his goods. So he brought this." Wanda nodded toward the blade, a look of distaste on his face. Vanessa looked at it too. Now that she knew what it was, its beauty seemed far less alluring. It seemed more like the cruel, evil weapon it was. She knew exactly how it was used. "They cut a person with one of those," she informed a dumbstruck Landon. "Then they draw the person's power out through the wound. That's all Mama would tell me." "Well, I know exactly how it's done," said Wanda. "It doesn't matter my knowing since I am not a magician. But if Vanessa knew," he added to his son, "she wouldn't be able to join the Far Reach. And I'm not going to tell you either. It's enough if you know how to recognize it." "But how do you know, Dalton?" whispered Landon. "Who told you?" "Ezra," said Wanda shortly. Vanessa noticed his fist clench under the table. She knew exactly why the mention of Ezra, the beautiful foreign magician who had been sent to Lightwood 13 years before, was painful to Wanda. She had been instructed by her people, whom she had refused to name, to seek the help of a thief on her mission to kill the errant slaves. The man she had picked was Wanda. He had just acquired the status of thief and had been dazzled by the enigmatic, playful young woman who finally showed her feelings for him the night Ilya first killed with shadow magic. After Thene's death, Ezra had been ordered away from Shadoya but had gone with a promise to contact Wanda soon. She never had, and although Wanda had quickly gotten over his passionate feelings for her, the pain of her lie and betrayal had never left him. Neither had the feeling of anger which had instead grown with the years. Vanessa felt a stab of sympathy for Wanda. It would have felt awful to have the woman he loved discard him. But he's better off without her, she thought. She seems awful. And Mama had to go through much worse when Thene died. Vanessa remembered the haunted look in Ilya's eyes whenever she spoke about Vanessa's father. She shuddered and cast her eyes about for a change of topic. Her eyes fell on the leather book. "So what's this?" she asked, picking it up. "A book on shadow magic," Wanda said. "That's why I wanted you to come here, Vanessa. That book is very dangerous. There's not much chance of it falling into the wrong hands, especially hands that know shadow magic. Still, I'd rather not take any chances with it. I want you to give it to your mother. And tell her not to read it. She knows only basic shadow magic. That book has much more. I don't think the other magicians would like it much." "They wouldn't," Vanessa confirmed. "But Wanda, why not bring it to the far reach yourself? Or send it?" "Like I said, I don't want to take chances with it falling into the wrong hands," replied Wanda. "And that's basically anybody. Also, the far reach and the thieves may have a truce, but I still don't trust them much. Except for you and your mother," he added, smiling as Vanessa opened her mouth indignantly. She closed it again, then looked down at the book and nodded. "I'll get it to Mama safely," she promised. "But I warn you, the other higher magicians will want to see it as well." "I don't mind that," replied Wanda. "So long as you don't show them how you got here, I'm even okay with a truth read." About that," began Vanessa. "I'm not too good at hiding stuff in my head at the moment, so Wanda," she was interrupted by guffaws as both Wanda and Landon choked with laughter. "Just kidding," said Wanda apologetically. Then he turned serious again. "I really don't mind you showing them, Vanessa, because this is a room built specially for meeting magicians. They know it exists, and the way, so feel free to let them do a truth read if they don't believe you." Okay," said Vanessa uncertainly, getting to her feet. Landon followed suit. Wanda handed Vanessa the little book which she pocketed. Then they all left the room, Wanda through the door to the room beyond and Vanessa and Landon into the passage. Yan nodded to the doorman before following them. They retraced their steps to the grill. This time Yan came through too, albeit with a little difficulty. They made their way back to the Merry Magician where Vanessa tipped the stable boy who had taken Lynn and mounted her. Then only did she remember the jeweled knife. "What are you going to do with the knife?" she asked Landon. He shrugged. "Sell off the stones, probably." "See you then, Vanessa," giving her one of his grins. "Bye, Landon," she said, smiling in return. "See you, Yan." "Safe travels, Miss Vanessa," grunted Yan. Vanessa turned Lynn around and urged her into a canter. She slipped a finger into her pocket and fingered the book. Her mother was about to get a huge surprise. "A book on shadow magic?" said Ilya, shocked. "That's what Landon called you for? To give you that?" "Well, he wasn't the one who exactly asked me there," Mama began Vanessa. When she finished the story 10 minutes later, Ilya's face was pale and she stared at the book lying on the table between them. She picked it up and examined. Then, closing her eyes, she sent out a mental call. "Tavan. Ilya? I need you to call a meeting of the higher magicians right away." "Why?" Ilya could sense the confusion and curiosity behind Tavan's question. She paused for a second before answering, "Shadow magic." She felt an immediate flood of emotions from the presence in her mind. She registered shock, fear and bewilderment in one rush. "What?" Tavan said urgently. "What did you do?" "Nothing," Ilya sent back indignantly. "I'll explain it to all the higher magicians at once. It'll be better that way." She felt a tinge of doubt from the man's mind. "Very well," he said. "I'll contact them all now and send you a message later." "That will be fine, Tavan." "Thank you." Ilya opened her eyes. Vanessa looked at her from across the table. Her eyes were wide with excitement and apprehension. Ilya swallowed. People often said Vanessa was the spitting image of her mother. They might look like Ilya and even have inherited most of her traits, but she was not just like Ilya. The dark eyes which now held Ilya's gaze had done the same thing with her many years ago, before Vanessa was born. The same eyes in a different face, a face Ilya had last seen in the flesh at his funeral, before the flames licked it up. She had not cried then, but she had later that evening in her bed, and for many nights afterward. The eyes Thien had given his daughter were only different in that, in his face, they had shown dislike, love, hate, worry, but Ilya had never seen them display the same emotions that shone in Vanessa's eyes now. Ilya felt a great surge of love for her daughter as she looked at her, A feeling only heightened as she remembered the slightly guilty look Vanessa had on her face as Ilya opened her eyes, a sure sign she had been listening in on the conversation. It was the sort of thing Thien would have done. "What now, Mama?" asked Vanessa before Ilya could open her mouth. The latter smiled and fondled one of Vanessa's tresses. "You'll have to come to the meeting with me and explain everything," she said. "They'll want to hear it from you, not me." "Will they do a truth read?" asked Vanessa. Ilya nodded. Vanessa sighed. "I was afraid of that," she said glumly. Ilya knew what was bothering her. "Don't worry, sweetie," she said reassuringly. Wanda knew what he was doing. "Guess so," said Vanessa. Ilya felt a stab from something unpleasant as she remembered something she'd been meaning to talk to Vanessa about. "Lissa," she said, sitting beside her daughter on the couch and gathering her into her arms, "how often do you go to the Merry Magician now?" Vanessa blinked, obviously surprised by the strange question. "Every Wednesday," she answered. "What do you do there?" Meet Landon, have some ball, then go to the races or something." "Is that all? What else should there be?" Ilya remained silent as she wondered how to approach the issue. She decided on plain speaking, as that was what Vanessa preferred. "It's about your behavior at the dollhouse," she said. Vanessa stared up in confusion and dismay. "What do you mean, Mama?" "Well, the people there have been complaining you'll throw your weight around too much." "But I don't." "Darling," said Ilya gently, "that's how you see it. You have connections with a thief and people seem to favor you. You've gotten too used to people listening to you and never speaking against you, so you've started to misuse those privileges." "Not knowingly," she said hastily. "You didn't know what you were doing. Now that you do, I know it won't happen again." "It won't, Mama," Vanessa said. Her voice sounded so small that Ilya held her closer. "It's not just that it's unfair on the Dwells," she went on, though she hated having to do so. "It's what they think of you too. You're going to join the Far Reach in a few months. You're already seen as someone not very likable." "It's not true and I'm not saying it is," she added forcefully. "But if you become a magician with those qualities, people will hate you, the way Dwells used to hate the Far Reach when I was a child. And those kinds of habits are harder to break as you get older." "I understand, Mama," said Vanessa. There wasn't a trace of a wobble in her voice. "I'll be better from now on. Promise." "And I know you'll keep that promise," murmured Ilya, dropping a kiss on Vanessa's forehead. The little girl made a disgusted face, but Ilya knew her daughter enjoyed immensely these quality moments between the two of them. A knock on the door interrupted it. Ilya willed the door open. Khan, Thien's old servant, entered bearing several dishes making up their midday meal. Ilya and Vanessa sat down next to each other and began to eat. "Are you feeling nervous?" Ilya asked. It was shortly before dusk and they were heading down the path toward the High Lord's residence. "A bit," Vanessa admitted. They passed two male novices who hastily stepped aside for them and bowed to Ilya as she passed. One boy smiled at Vanessa but his friend nudged him hard in the ribs with a startled glance at Ilya. Vanessa smiled at the boys, vaguely recognizing them as two of last year's winter intake of novices. She was not surprised that they were intimidated by Ilya's presence. Her small stature and big-eyed, pretty face belied her formidable reputation. She had been the only one to believe High Lord Thien when he explained the reasons for which he learned shadow magic. As his novice and also one of the three people who knew his secret, Ilya had been told a story of capture, imprisonment, life as an errand slave and escape to the Far Reach. Not only had she sympathized with him but she had offered to learn shadow magic so that should anything happen to him, she would be able to continue his mission. When Thien had been charged with the murder of another magician and learning shadow magic, Ilya had stood staunchly by him as he admitted to the latter charge and refused her own offer of staying back in the Far Reach, opting to go into exile in Foria with Thien. Along the way, she had fallen in love with him and he admitted to falling for her long before that. This had resulted in Vanessa's birth a few months after the Aran invasion and Thien's death. Ilya had been pardoned and accepted back into the Far Reach under the title of Shadow Magician. Should Shadow ever face a threat from shadow magic again, it would be her duty to teach a select group of magicians the art and lead them into battle against the invaders. Naturally strong enough to let her powers surface on their own, Ilya's reserves of magical strength were huge, and with her black robes and history, she seemed quite formidable to anyone who didn't know her, like the two novices. As they passed out of earshot, Ilya sighed and said, "Don't be. All you have to do is tell the story and let me handle the rest. Let Tavan or Vanara perform the truth read, then when they dismiss you, go back to our rooms and read those last few books." Last few books. "Thanks for reminding me," Vanessa said glumly as they reached the High Lord's residence and Ilya tapped on the door. It swung open immediately, revealing a guest room filled with magicians. Several globe lights hovered near the ceiling, shedding light on their faces. High Lord Radar stood out starkly in his white robes. Director Finn wore his usual frown. Lord Pekin, head of alchemy, acknowledged them with a respectful nod. Lord Civil, head of alchemic studies, and the other two heads of studies did likewise, Civil adding a smile. Ilya returned it. Civil had been her first guardian, her mentor and friend when she first joined the Far Reach. He had been the father she had never had, as her own father had left her when she was a baby. Administrator Tavan and Lady Vanara also smiled at Ilya. All the magicians' expressions changed to surprise, however, when Vanessa stepped into the room beside her mother and pulled the door shut behind her. She half hid behind Ilya's robes as the magicians looked toward her mother for an explanation. Radar stepped forward. "Shadow Magician," he said. Ilya inclined her head politely. "High Lord." "Normally I would ask right away why you requested this meeting," Radar went on, "but as Lord Vaughan is inconveniently late, I shall postpone that question. However, I wish to know immediately why you have brought your daughter here." "High Lord," Ilya replied, "I brought Vanessa because she plays a key role in this story. It was she who brought this book." She held up the leather-bound book to me. "It contains information on shadow magic." There were gasps all around. Several people paled. Radar stepped forward and took the book from Ilya's grasp. "How do you know?" he demanded. "Did you read it?" "Did you?" he added, looking at Vanessa. She numbly shook her head. "Neither of us read it," Ilya said. At that moment, the door opened and Vaughan, the head of warriors, walked in. "Forgive me my tardiness," he said to the room. "Urgent little matter with one of my students." "It doesn't matter, Vaughan," said Tavan. "Please take a seat. We just started a very serious discussion. I'm sure you will want to be a part of it." Vaughan sat down, casting a questioning look at Vanessa as he did so. She swallowed as Ilya continued. "Vanessa went to meet her friend Landon in the slums this morning. He had sent her an urgent message requesting a meeting and she complied." All the magicians present stared at Vanessa. She felt her face heat up as she said, "Well, Landon Vaughan smiled derisively, "met me at the Merry Magician Dollhouse." Pekin frowned at the name and she finished her story as fast as she could and took a deep, calming breath. The higher magicians all looked startled and worried. They gazed at the book sitting on the table between Tavan and Radar. The latter picked it up and seemed about to rifle through its pages, then stopped himself. He handed it to Ilya, who took it reluctantly and was just about to open it when Lady Vanara stood up. "Wait," she said sharply. "According to Vanessa, that book contains more than basic shadow magic. There is no need for you to know more than you do, Ilya. Don't read it." "But if she doesn't, how will we know if it is about shadow magic?" asked Pekin. "The thief might have believed it to be so, but we cannot be certain unless one of us reads it. And how could a thief know how to recognize shadow magic anyway?" "I don't know," Ilya admitted. "I do, my lord," said Vanessa. All eyes turned toward her again. She told them Ezra's story, omitting the part about her relationship with Wanda. When she finished, Director Finn was shaking his head and Vaughan was scowling. "Just like a Forian to reveal dangerous secrets to a man she barely knows," he sneered. "I wondered how many other people she has told." "None," my lord," said Vanessa. "She only told Wanda because they were friends." "Friends?" Pekin repeated, scowling. "A thief with a foreign magician for a friend? This needs looking into, I think," he said to Radar. As the High Lord started to nod, Vanessa hastily said, "No, my lord. Waylon hasn't seen Ezra since then, nor has he made any contact with her, or she with him." She waited with bated breath as Radar thought. All the higher magicians were looking at the High Lord. He finally said, "I believe you, Vanessa, as does everyone else here." Vaughn gave a small, disbelieving snort. Tavon glanced sharply at him. "However, rules dictate that in this kind of situation we must perform a truth read. Will you consent?" Vanessa nodded. "I will, my lord." Radar looked around at the assembled crowd. "Who will perform the truth read?" Civil and Tavon both rose. Radar looked at them both, then nodded at Tavon, who walked toward Vanessa. He gave her a smile as he placed his hands on her temples. "Show me the room of your mind." Immediately, Vanessa called it up, a larger, airier version of her bedroom. She opened the door. Standing outside was Tavon. She took his hand and pulled him in. "Vanessa," he said, "I want you to show me all your memories of this morning." She nodded and led him to a painting which filled up an entire wall. She showed him everything that had happened from the moment Khan delivered the message to her at the breakfast table till she said goodbye to Landon and Yan. She felt a slight wave of surprise and annoyance from Tavon as he watched how she treated the waitress. "Mama spoke to me about that earlier," she said. "It's under control." The Tavon at her side nodded, then exited through the door. Opening her eyes, Vanessa saw the real Tavon draw his hands away from her head. He turned to face the room. "Everything she said is true," he announced. There was a stir. Ilya smiled at Vanessa. "Is that all Vanessa will be needed for, High Lord?" Radar nodded. Ilya turned to her daughter. "Then you can go. Finish those books so we can discuss them over dinner." "All right, Mama," grinned Vanessa. She respectfully bowed to all the magicians before leaving the house. The sun still hadn't set by the time she reached the magicians' quarters. She strolled inside and went to her mother's apartments. She crashed herself down on the couch in the guest room and reluctantly picked up one of the 2 books on the semi-table in front of her and started to read. After a few minutes of fruitlessly trying to absorb the information in it, she picked up both books and took them to her room instead. There also she didn't make any progress with the first book, so she gave it up as a bad job and reached for the second. As she randomly flicked through the pages looking for something interesting to read, a small black book fell out of it onto her lap. Vanessa picked it up in confusion and opened it at the first page. Excitement coursed through her as she recognized her mother's familiar handwriting. She was about to read the first line when a thought stopped her. "It looks like a diary. Maybe I shouldn't read it. Mama wouldn't want me to know her private thoughts." Sighing heavily, she was about to set it aside when she saw the date. Her heart jumped when she saw it was only a few weeks after Thiene's death. Mama must have written about that. Without further ado, she yanked the diary open and started reading the first entry. At first, Ilya seemed to have written only about the 5 days of terror and death known as the Iran invasion. She described it without much detail, and Vanessa was getting frustrated when she reached the final passage. "Thiene is dead," it began. Vanessa jerked up and began to read avidly. Soria hid his dagger in the earth, and when our shield went over it, it went straight into Thiene's chest. He wouldn't let me heal him but made me use my power on the Iran. It wasn't enough to deal with all 3 of them, so Thiene gave me his last bit of power. I killed the last man, then turned to Thiene. His eyes were empty. When I searched his body for power, there was nothing. He had given me everything. I had killed him." The entry ended there. The last word was barely discernible because it had been almost smudged away. Now that Vanessa looked closer, there were other places where the ink had run. They had been smudged by the tears Ilya shed as she wrote the last paragraph. Vanessa's own eyes burned and she blinked. "You didn't kill him, Mama," she thought. A hot surge of anger coursed through her. The errand did. He knew what would happen if he gave you his power. He did it because he wanted you to be safe. Brushing away the tears that had formed, she turned to the next page and read on. The next few entries, spaced several weeks apart, spoke of Shadoya's efforts to recover, the Praetor's new policies concerning the thieves in particular, the Far Reach's steady recruiting of children from the merchants' families and the construction of the new hospital in the slums. Ilya had written little about herself, only that she had been accepted back into the Far Reach and would be called Shadow Magician. Vanessa turned over to a new page. The entry had been written about 4 months after Thene's death. I can't write the word. I told Thana and Sylvil yesterday and now Ganna knows too. I asked Thana to come live with me to help me and she's bringing Lorne and my cousins next week. I'm really scared. I didn't plan for this. I'm not ready to be a mother. Even with Thana's help I don't think I can cope. I wonder what Thene would say if he knew. I wish he were here. I need him so badly, more than I need this baby. I didn't ask for it, after all. A cold chill passed through Vanessa's heart. I don't think I even want it, though I asked Thana for help. This baby will always only remind me of Thene, of how he died and I survived, something I hate myself for doing. It'll look like him, I'm sure, and will only be a reminder of our time together. And that's something I'd rather forget since it can never be again. No, I definitely don't want this baby, I'd rather lose it because then I won't always remember Thene died. Also the child will be proof of our time together. While my friends and family have understood, I worry how everyone else will react. This could be bad for both Thene's name and mine. If only he were here, then we could get married and I could accept our child and actually be proud to call it mine. The entry ended there. The diary thudded to the floor as Vanessa stood up and backed away from it. She couldn't believe what she had just read. Her mother didn't want her. She felt lightheaded with shock and swayed. Her knees gave way and she tumbled down onto the carpet. She buried her face in it as deep, raw sobs threatened to burst through her windpipe and out of her mouth. She was blinded by tears which she valiantly held back. Taking deep breaths to hold off her crying, she stared at the diary. Then, with a cry that sounded more like a gasp, she kicked it under the bed and ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She did the same with the guest room door. There was nobody in the corridor outside. She sprinted down it and jumped down the staircase 4 steps at a time. Hurtling along the corridor downstairs, she banged right into a tall figure wearing red warrior robes. She bounced away from it and lost her balance. She would have fallen if 2 hands hadn't gripped her shoulders. "You might want to watch where you're going," a man's voice chided. Vanessa recognized it instantly. "Lord Reagan," she said, hastily backing away and bowing. "Forgive me and thank you for catching me." "Excuse me please, I need to go. Is something wrong?" asked Reagan, a trace of concern in his voice. Vanessa glanced away from him, terrified her eyes would betray her. "No, my lord," she said, thankful her voice didn't shake. "But I must go please." "All right," said Reagan, stepping aside. Vanessa could sense his eyes boring into her as she passed him and went out through the back door. Once outside, she started running again, past the baths and the road leading to the servants' quarters, into the forest and up to the clearing where the spring began. Exhausted, she threw herself down onto the grass. Virgin lay panting. The sun had finally set and twilight was rolling in, the first stars glimmering dimly in the sky above her. Others soon started filling up the space in the black vastness until the sky looked like a blanket sprinkled with silver glitter. As Vanessa stared up at it, her own insignificance in comparison to the universe caught up with her. Insignificant and wanted, the heart rose up in her again, the shock, the anger and foremost the wretchedness. She tried to stop the crying but this time it was impossible. It didn't matter anyway. There was no danger of anyone hearing or seeing her weakness this time. She sobbed until she could cry no more and lay there in the darkness as if dead. For the tears had brought a headache, the headache tiredness and the tiredness finally sleep. Vanessa blinked, her eyes open. Although what she saw was the familiar ceiling of her bedroom, it felt wrong. She wondered why. Then the events of the last evening came flooding back to her. The last thing she remembered was the stars seeming to fade as her eyes began to close. How then had she got here? She sat bolt upright in bed and flung the covers off herself. The noise her feet made as they struck the carpet was unusually loud. So loud, the door opened and someone peered in. Vanessa barely stopped herself from recoiling. The person was her mother, who immediately entered the room. "Vanessa," she said gladly. "I was hoping you would wake up soon." Ilya's hair was tousled and she was still in her nightclothes. She looked like she had been up half the night. She took Vanessa into her arms and hugged her tightly. "I was so worried when I got back and you weren't here. Khan said he didn't see you at all. I sent out a mental call. Why didn't you answer me?" "I fell asleep," mumbled Vanessa, disentangling herself from her mother's arms. "Why by the stream?" asked Ilya. "Why did you go there, darling?" Vanessa turned sharply as she remembered something. "Who found me there?" she demanded. "Reagan," replied Ilya. "I asked all the magicians to help find you and Reagan tracked you to the stream and carried you back here." Vanessa turned back to the window, her question having been answered. "Are you all right, Vanessa?" inquired Ilya when no further words came from her. "You seem white. Are you sick?" "No, I'm not," Vanessa said even as her mother pressed a hand to her forehead to check her temperature. "It's high," Ilya confirmed. "You're staying in bed today, understand? No moving about at all. And don't bother finishing these," she added, picking up the 2 history books from the nightstand. The sight made Vanessa panic. The diary was in one of those. But she just as soon relaxed as she remembered kicking it under the bed. Forcing herself to accept one last kiss from her mother, she climbed back into bed and huddled into a ball under the covers. Ilya checked her temperature again, frowned, then sent some healing energy into Vanessa's body. It did little for the raging fever that was starting to consume her. Her lack of food and the shock of the night before coincided with it, and she fainted clean away right in front of Ilya's horrified eyes. "How is she?" asked Civil, taking a sip of some. It was a Wednesday morning almost a week later, and he was sharing a drink with Ilya in her rooms. Vanessa was asleep in her bedroom. After her fainting spell, she had had barely enough strength to move and kept throwing up everything she took in, including water. Ilya had been nearly crazed with fear, and even Vanara had been worried. Kenna, Civil's son, had asked for constant updates on Vanessa's condition. He cared for her deeply, as she was the daughter he might have had if Thien hadn't taken Ilya hostage. During her early years the two of them had been inseparable, playing, laughing and talking. When Kenna had been asked to return to the village he had served before the Aran invasion, Vanessa had been inconsolable. She had wept bitterly after he left, soon after she turned 5, and nothing Ilya nor Civil nor Tavan did could comfort her. "Much better," replied Ilya, and Civil came back to the present. "She just stopped vomiting and the fever went down immediately. I said that she'd be able to go out this afternoon." "You'd better tell Kenna," Ilya added with a quick smile. "I will," Civil promised ruefully. "Tell Vanessa not to make a habit of falling ill, because I don't think I could take another set of interrogations like that." "I'll pass it on," grinned Ilya. Someone knocked on the door. Khan opened it. Standing outside was Landon. "Ilya," he said, practically tumbling into the room, "can I please speak to Vanessa?" He saw Civil and stopped short. Civil smiled and gestured with his free hand. "Don't let me stop you." "Right," said Landon, looking slightly preoccupied. "Well, can I speak to Vanessa, Ilya?" "I'll make it quick. It's urgent." "She's still asleep, Landon," said Ilya. "If you want, I'm up," said a familiar voice behind them. Civil turned and there was Vanessa, still looking rather pale and very fragile, as if a puff of wind would blow her away like a feather. Her eyes seemed to have sunk deeper into their sockets, but they were still bright. She walked over to stand behind Landon. "I'll be back soon," she said to Ilya and Civil. Giving Civil a nod and a smile, she walked out of the room followed by Landon. Ilya sighed as the door closed behind them. She waited until Khan had collected the breakfast tray and gone before saying, "I'm worried about Vanessa, Civil." Civil cast a questioning look at her. "Because of her illness? But she seems fine now." "I'm not talking about that," said Ilya. "Though it might have been the cause, but I'm not so sure. Vanessa just seems different." "How so?" Civil asked. Ilya shrugged. "Tiny differences, really hard to notice. She always looks everyone in the eye when she talks, but these past few days she's hardly looked at me at all. And she doesn't want to speak to anyone, and especially not to me. I don't know what to make of it." Ilya rested her forehead on her hand. "I'm worried that there's something going on that's affecting her, and I need to know what it is in case it's having a bad effect on her. But I get without asking, and she won't welcome that. I don't know what to do." "I don't think you should overly concern yourself, Ilya," said Civil gently. "She's a teenager now, and teenagers, girls especially, go through a lot of changes. It would be best to just keep an eye on her. But don't let her think you're spying, or there will be trouble." Ilya smiled at him. "Thank you, Civil. I'll do that." Chapter 2. "So you're all better then?" Landon asked as they walked along in the direction of the gardens. They passed a lone novice going in the opposite direction. The novice waved at Vanessa and she waved back, although somewhat distractedly. This made Landon feel more cheerful, therefore more patient, and he repeated the question. "Yeah," said Vanessa. "It was just viral flu, I'm fine now." "But why did you come here, Landon?" "We were going to meet this afternoon anyway." "Farther," replied Landon. "He wanted to hear only from you what happened to the book, and as soon as possible, so I came." "The higher magicians held a meeting about it," said Vanessa. "I just told them how I got it. Talvon did a truth read, and I was told to. Mama told me that they had stashed the book away with all the other shadow magic objects. Only she, Radar, Talvon and Vanara know where it is." "Well," Vanessa smiled mischievously, "that's what they think." "What do you mean?" demanded Landon, stopping short. A few magicians turned up walking along the path. Landon and Vanessa bowed as they passed, then she tugged him along on their way. "I know the place," she whispered. "In one of the passages under the university. There's a little opening in a wall, and they've buried the chest in that. I found it when I was exploring the passages. Fortunately, Radar doesn't roam them like Thien used to." "And your mom wouldn't know, you know?" said Landon incredulously. Vanessa shook her head. "Wow. How many more things have you been keeping secret?" "A lot," said Vanessa. Her voice suddenly seemed dull. Landon turned to look at his friend. Although he was a full head taller than her, she suddenly seemed much older than him, something that normally wasn't noticeable. He remembered that she was only a few months away from turning 14, after which she would join the Far Reach. He wondered how that would change things between them. He would have to start calling her my lady in company and bow once she became a fully fledged magician. That is, if he ever saw her again. His father, after all, didn't trust the Far Reach. Although he claimed that he and Ilya retained the friendship of their youth, they hadn't seen each other in years. Landon knew that Wanda still considered Ilya a friend, but that didn't seem much point when they never even contacted each other. Landon fervently hoped that would never happen to him and Vanessa. The idea of losing his best friend caused him a pang in his chest. They reached the stables where Landon's horse, Jin, was brought out to him. Before mounting her, he hugged Vanessa goodbye. Normally she would have returned it, but now she stood still in his embrace. He let go and gazed at her, puzzled. She gave him a quick grin and, reassured, he climbed up onto Jin's back and rode out of the Far Reach gates. Vanessa waved to her friend until he was out of sight. Then she turned around and started back to the magician's quarters. She opened the door to her apartments to find her mother alone. Civil had left. Ilya looked up from the book she was reading, smiled and gestured to the table where a dish of savory breads had been put, along with a mug of rice. Vanessa wordlessly sat down and began to eat her breakfast. Ilya didn't go back to her book, just sat next to Vanessa, waiting for her to finish. As Vanessa drained her mug to the dregs, Ilya said, "I'm going to the Dwells hospital now. I'll be there till sundown. Afterward I need to meet Lord Boaz to discuss new plans for a new slum hospital, so I probably won't be back until dinner time. Will you be alright till then?" "Yes," muttered Vanessa. "What are you going to do?" asked Ilya. "I'm going to meet Landon," Vanessa replied, eyes fixed on the crumbs on her plate. Ilya leaned forward and took Vanessa's chin in her hand and raised it. She seemed about to say something, but she didn't, instead planting a kiss on Vanessa's cheek before getting up from the table. She pulled on a cloak just as there was a knock on the door. Vanessa opened it. A gaggle of magicians stood outside, waiting to escort Ilya to the slums. She stood aside as her mother went out, then shut the door. She went into her bedroom and flung herself onto the bed. Her little finger pressed down on the spot where Ilya had kissed her. Vanessa remembered the surprised look on Landon's face when she hadn't hugged him. Because of her mother. If her own mother could lie to her, then someone who claimed to be a friend could too. Vanessa knew for certain that she'd never trust anyone again. Was everybody lying to her then? Did no one care? Vanessa suddenly shook herself irritably. "This is crazy," she thought. "Just because she wrote that about me doesn't mean everybody just hates me. That diary seems more like a dream now. A nightmare, that was all. I must have fallen asleep over one of those books." Why, then, did she remember so vividly the way her heart had thumped at what she had just read, running away as fast as her legs could take her and crying herself to sleep by the stream? She brushed some hair out of her eyes. Whoa, she suddenly thought. If it was a dream, then the diary isn't real. A feeling of fear crept over her as she remembered kicking it under the bed. She hadn't seen it since that night. All she needed to do was look under the bed. A cold foreboding took over her heart, but she pushed it away. She craned her neck over the edge. Lying in the gloom was the distinct shape of a book. Reaching out a trembling hand, Vanessa picked it up. The book automatically opened at the end of the fateful entry. She went to the beginning and started reading it again. When she finished, she put a piece of paper at the beginning and closed the book. She felt no great wave of shock this time, or horror, disbelief or misery that had completely consumed her last time. There was only a feeling of resignation. So it's true then. Getting up, she opened the wardrobe door and placed the diary between two shirts she wore for special occasions. Closing and locking the door behind her, she went out of the apartment and walked down through the gardens to the university. Since it was a Wednesday, she knew there wasn't much fear of anyone seeing her. Director Finn was sure to be in his office, and she could easily avoid any servants who might be cleaning the building. Using a few shortcuts, she reached a corridor which had one life-size painting of an alchemist hanging on one wall. She swung it aside to reveal one of the secret passages that led under the university. Stepping into the gloom, she let the painting swing back into place behind her, plunging her into complete darkness. This didn't worry her, for she had explored the tunnel so thoroughly she could make her way through them anywhere, even without a light. Her sense of direction had always been good. She now let it guide her through the rocky tunnels for what seemed like hours, until she reached a point where they widened out into a sort of clearing. When she wanted to be certain of not being found, this was where she came. She sat down on a rock and brooded on the diary's words. Certain phrases drifted into her thoughts. I definitely don't want this baby. This baby will always only remind me of Fiend. I need him more than I need this baby. D rather lose it. He child will be proof of our time together. If only he were here, then we could get married and I could accept our child and actually be proud to call it mine. She jumped to her feet and paced about agitatedly. How could she have written that? She suddenly screamed and punched the rock wall. All it gave her was a burning pain in her fingers, but Vanessa was too incensed to care. Roaring inside her was the rage she had been suppressing all week. It was so unfair. Her mother hadn't even given Vanessa a chance. She had simply stated, boldly, I don't want this baby. She hadn't waited to see how Vanessa would turn out, she had just coldly rejected her before she was even born. She didn't care for Vanessa at all. Her love all these years had been a charade, an act. None of it had been genuine. And I loved her. Vanessa shrieked mentally. All this time I thought I was only returning it, but actually I was the only one giving it. All wasted on her. She's never loved me. She loves only Thien. She wants only him. Well, I wish that he hadn't died, and I had never been born, then all of us would be happy. I definitely do not want the two of them for parents. Even if Thien had lived, Ilya still wouldn't love me because all she cares about is him. Then a new thought came to her. Its notion first chilled her. Then she brooded on it. Why don't I just run away? She walked up and down as she thought about it. Yeah, why not? It'll be a blessing on both of us. She won't even miss me. Though Civil probably will. Her heart panged. So will Kenna. Wait, I could go live with Kenna. He loves me. A doubt crept into her thoughts. Or does he? She thrust it away. Even if he does, he'll just make me go back to Ilya. With relish, Vanessa realized that she was already thinking of her mother not as Mama but Ilya. They were already growing apart, the bonds between them breaking, even if Ilya didn't realize it yet. Or maybe she did. After all, she was smart. It didn't make any difference though. No, I can go to Kenna. He'll never let me stay with him. He'll ask questions. I'm not going to tell anyone about the diary. That's my secret. It'll be best to just go. I'll leave Shadoya. They'll find me if I stay here. I'll disguise myself and go to Lyra or Vin and make a living there somehow. The prospect was daunting, but doable. Vanessa came to a stop and rested her hand against the wall. It wasn't there and her hand went through thin air, making her stumble. She caught herself and looked around. Unknowingly, immersed in her thoughts, she had come to the place where the chest containing the books on shadow magic was hidden. A savage smile lit up her features. What do I care what Ilya thinks about shadow magic? She thought. I'll do whatever she doesn't like. After all, I'm not going to become a magician now. It won't matter me knowing shadow magic. It's not like I'll use it. Or be able to. She remembered being told how Lord Sarin, the former head of alchemy, had failed to learn shadow magic from the ancient books, necessitating Ilya and Thien's return to become Shadoya's saviors. A brainwave came to her. But maybe I can learn. I could go to Foria and become one of their shadow magicians. That's perfect. I've already got my powers awakened. Like Ilya, Vanessa's powers had been strong enough to develop on their own. Ilya had lost no time teaching her control. Yet another ruse to show the world she cared, of course. But first I'd better prove my worth. They'll be impressed if I already know shadow magic. Which means I'd better start reading. Without further ado, she dug up the chest using her fingers and flung open the lid. Her eyes alighted on the topmost book, a familiar leather-bound volume. At first, she thought, reaching for it. Tucking it into her jacket pocket, she closed the chest's lid and went off to find some light. She'd come back for the other books later. Vanessa locked her bedroom door and sat down cross-legged on the center of her bed. Her room was the perfect place to read in peace. It was light, she couldn't be disturbed even by comment. If any visitors knocked on the guest room door, she would have plenty of time to hide the book. Ilya wouldn't be back for hours and there were still a few hours left before leaving to meet Landon. Opening the book, Vanessa began to read. 2 hours later her mind was reeling. I changed my mind, she thought. I don't want to become a shadow magician. The book described not only the basic drawing of power but also methods of killing and torture too gruesome to describe. Whenever Vanessa met the beginning of an instruction she turned to the next page. However, she had finally come to a point where she could take no more. That's it, she declared, throwing the book down. It landed spine-bent on the floor. She picked it up to close it, then froze as she saw the heading on the page, Bringing back the dead. Feverishly yanking the page open, she began to read. For centuries, humankind has sought a way to bring loved ones back from the dead. There is only one method, discovered decades before the writing of this book. It is not known to many and can be highly dangerous as it involves speaking with the spirits. To perform it, the caller must be situated at the altar of either the dark crystal caves of Phoria, the smoking labyrinth of Cronoth, or the tomb of White Tears in Lyre, the only truly spiritual places in the known world. If the deceased's body is not intact, some artifact of it must be presented for the making of a new body. The ritual involves the gift of power from one willing mortal, channeled into the body of one higher magician, who will then induct their combined powers into the calling of the Praetor of Spirits, who alone will decide the fate of the callers as well as the deceased, for if provoked he will add them to his army of spirits. This meeting can be conducted only at sunrise or sundown on either the spring or fall equinox, or the winter or summer solstice. This knowledge is to be kept as secret as possible, as otherwise, due to the overflow of supernatural energies, the world would fall apart. It is recorded here only so that in times of great need it might be used. Vanessa folded down a corner of the page and closed the book. Her heart was thudding as loudly as it had on the night she had read the diary. She hardly dared to believe that the answer to her problem was not just real but there, in front of her. Yet it was, and she would be a fool not to use that knowledge. I can bring Thien back. A green shoot of hope blossomed in her chest. Then Mama won't have reason to hate me anymore. We'll be together as a real family. I'll get to meet my father. An exhilarating thought came to her. I might even get a brother or sister. She jumped to her feet and paced about, thinking. The spring equinox. That's only 4 weeks away. The dark crystal caves are the closest. Looks like I'm going to Phoria after all. And they've got plenty of shadow magicians there. So long as I pay them well. Then one realization flattened her. Some artifact of the deceased's body. How am I going to get that? He was cremated. Then the newly tapped spring of ideas in her mind threw her another gift. The blood rings. After the invasion, Ilya had continued to wear the ring Thien had made for her out of glass and his own blood. It enabled the maker to have a constant bond with the wearer, sharing their thoughts and feelings and enabling them to conduct magical conversations on which other magicians couldn't eavesdrop. Thien had made another one for Khan, his servant and friend, long before that. Both blood rings had been taken away from their owners and stashed away with Lorne's and Ilya's blood rings, the Phoria knives and shadow magic books. So I'll go and get the blood rings, Vanessa thought. I'll leave for Phoria straight away. I'll probably have to go to Kura. That's a long way. I hope it's safe. She mentally reprimanded herself. You're a 13-year-old girl who looks 10 and you'll be traveling with a horse and money. The very least that can happen in Phoria is meeting bandits. Make that Shadoya too. She tapped her chin with 2 fingers. I'll have to take a weapon, she decided. Even though I'm not good with them. She opened the door and went out to the university for the second time. Finding her way into the tunnels, she ran eagerly down to the chest's hiding place. Plunging her hand into the contents, she soon brought out a tiny bag which when opened revealed 4 rings, 3 gold and 1 silver. She took all except the smallest gold ring, which she knew was Ilya's. She locked and buried the trunk before running back to the magician's quarters. She locked herself in her room again and grabbed a pen. She was about to pick up a piece of paper when a thought struck her. I can tell them where I'm going, they'll stop me, even Mama. I was planning to run away anyway. I'll do that then. I won't leave a note or anything. She picked up a rack instead, then paused. I could take any of my own stuff. They could trace me through that. I'll get some second-hand clothes in the market. She set the bag down and went to the little drawer in which she kept her accessories and prized possessions. Drawing it all the way out, she reached for the money pouch concealed in the cavity within. Vanessa had never been one to spend a lot. She preferred to save much of it instead, in case she ever needed it for something worth spending on. And this journey was definitely that. Emptying as much money as possible into her purse and the rest into her pockets, Vanessa quickly tidied up the room so nothing seemed out of order, then, concealing the shadow magic book beneath her jacket again, walked out of the apartment without a backward glance. She walked slowly down to the stables, careful not to let the coins jingle too much. This wasn't a problem when she started riding into the city 5 minutes later. Lynn's hooves made such a racket clomping along the road that nobody heard. Vanessa went into the market in the North Quarter. Dismounting so that she would attract less attention, she held Lynn by the reins and went over to a clothes seller's stall. She quickly picked up a shirt which would once have been cream-colored but now was sadly stained in several places, faded, worn thin at the elbows, reached her thigh and had a large rip near the hem. The trousers she chose were light brown and there were frayed threads near the edges, along with a few scorch marks. They were inside out. When she turned them out she was delighted to discover it had several large pockets. There was definitely no need for a rack. The trader was shooting odd looks at the fine clothes Vanessa was wearing and at Lynn, who was obviously a fine, well-bred horse and looked very out of place in the lowly, bustling market. Vanessa knew the man was wondering at her motive for buying the cheap clothes, and she also bought a new cloak and tipped him with an extra coin and a big smile, hoping it would distract him. She moved away and bought a small, sharp dagger. She couldn't buy anything bigger as she was clumsy with weapons and would probably cut herself. She knew she would seem very vulnerable to the bandits on the lonely Dalian and foreign roads. It was a risk she would have to take. Fortunately Lynn was a very fast runner. Vanessa mounted her again and rode into the north side of the slums, taking care to keep out of sight of the Far Reach Hospital. She looked up at the sun as she rode past the Merry Magician and felt a twinge of guilt. In 15 minutes she was supposed to meet Landon there. The activities he had planned for that afternoon would never take place. She felt a pang of longing as she wondered when she would see him again, then stopped short as an incredible idea came to her. It was stupid, short-sighted and extremely selfish, as Landon would have no idea what he was getting into. But he was quite capable of looking after himself, as she knew from long experience, and he was extremely skilled with knives. And he didn't need to go with her all the way. Partly he turned around and galloped toward the dollhouse. There were no stable hands around this time, which suited her. She tied Lynn up, put on her new cloak and sidled into the dollhouse. She peeked around from under her hood. Landon had not yet arrived. The boho was much rowdier than she was used to. All the customers were laughing and talking freely as they slurped down their ball. The waitresses bawled out over the heads of the crowd and the barman roared cheerfully as he picked up the mugs. Although it was still rather early for it, one man had gotten drunk and was dancing a jig on one of the tables as the people around him hooted appreciatively. Vanessa laughed along with them, wondering why everyone seemed so energetic today. As she caught sight of her hooded figure in a mirror, she understood. Always when she'd entered the dollhouse before, a hush had fallen over the crowd as they all watched her. She'd never understood that the slight tension she felt in the air then was caused by their wariness, hostility, even fear of her. Now its absence caught her off guard, and she saw that, thanks to the cloak, she could not be recognized. Head lowered, she ducked into the latrines and locked the door behind her. Pulling off the cloak and emptying her pockets, she stripped off all her well-made, handsome clothes and replaced them with the new ones from the market. She tucked the money, the purse and the book into the pockets of her trousers, which she had turned inside out again to wear, the theory being that potential thieves would see her riding empty-handed and leave her alone. She gathered up her old clothes then, without a moment's hesitation, threw them down the piss drain. She did hesitate when she drew out the dagger. She studied her face in the mirror. Why did the idea of cutting her hair sadden her? She had always wanted it short, but her mother had made her grow it. And she would be much harder to recognize without it. But it was so long and glossy and thick, and curled so attractively at the end that she couldn't help feeling a pang of loss. Sighing heavily, she grabbed the waist-length tail and cut through the hairband that bound it. It fell away, leaving Vanessa holding a long curl of hair in one hand. She threw that down the drain as well, then shook her now very short locks to dislodge any stray hairs before pulling on the cloak again. It covered her completely, hiding the change of clothes and the hair from everybody, including Landon, who had arrived while she was inside. He didn't seem to mind the noise, and the patrons didn't seem to mind him either, for they were as ruckus as before. Landon was drumming his fingers on the table, an empty mug in front of him. Vanessa grinned as she walked toward him. Landon didn't look up as a short-hooded stranger made their way in his direction. He did take notice, however, when the hooded person sat down at his table. He or she seemed not to have noticed him. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said politely, but there was an unmistakable hint of a threat in it. "That place is reserved for a friend of mine." The figure didn't turn to face him. A soft, low voice came from beneath the hood. "Perhaps she's already here." Landon frowned in puzzlement. He couldn't figure out what the person meant. And there was something oddly familiar about the voice. "And how do you know my friend is a girl?" he asked. The figure snorted. "It's obvious. You hang around with her all the time. I've seen you in here for years." "Really?" said Landon. "How? I don't think I've seen you before." The person turned to him. "Are you sure about that?" the voice asked, suddenly slipping an octave higher. Two familiar dark eyes gleamed from within the hood. Landon's jaw dropped. "Me," he began before she flung a finger to her lips. He closed his mouth again and instead stared at the outfit she was wearing, which definitely looked the worse for wear. Her cheeks seemed flushed, her skin was paler than in the morning, and her eyes were unusually bright. "You okay?" he asked, concerned. "You look like you're still sick. Maybe you should go home. We could go to the races another day." "No, Landon," whispered Vanessa, leaning in and indicating that he should do the same. He complied, feeling a slight sense of unease at their proximity. They were literally face to face. "I need your help." Landon raised his eyebrows. "Don't you always?" He smiled. She didn't return it. He felt it fade. "I'm leaving Lightwood for a while," said Vanessa. "I'm going to visit Uncle Kana's village. Vanara said it would be good for me. They won't let Mama come with me. I can go on my own. It's too dangerous. I need protection from the thieves. I can go as the Shadow Magician's daughter, cause I might get kidnapped or something, even with a magician escort. So could you speak to your father?" "You crazy?" exclaimed Landon. "Of course we'll help you. Actually," he grinned, "you don't need any of the others. I'll go with you." Vanessa's grin widened. This was just what she had been waiting for. "Really?" she breathed. "Thanks a load, Landon." "No prob," he replied, waving a breezy hand, then paused. Why are you dressed like that? And where's your stuff?" "I can go as Ilya's daughter, remember? I'm going for total cover. I'm not taking any stuff with me, cause I'll be wearing villagers' clothes there, which Kana has with him. And by the way, you can't tell anyone where you're going. For my protection." "That's fine," said Landon. "I can disappear for as long as I want. I'll just go get Jin and my stuff." And he was off, whistling cheerfully. Vanessa's smile reached breaking point. She couldn't have asked for better. Landon brushed a sweat-soaked lock of hair out of his eyes. He kept them half closed to avoid the glare of the sun as it reflected off the dusty, blindingly white road and blazed down on its weary travelers without mercy. His head seemed to be a trap for heat and dust, and there were sap flies circling it, attracted to the strong stench of sweat. He wiped beads of perspiration off his brow, then glanced at Vanessa. To his amazement, she was still wearing that hood. Since the day before when she had met him, she hadn't taken it off except once when she was bathing in the river that morning. Landon had gone off into the trees with the horses to give her some privacy, and so hadn't seen it come off or go back on. He couldn't get how she could stand the heat contained within that scrap of cloth, even if it did provide shade. "Don't you ever take that thing off?" he asked. Vanessa shook her head. "I can't, because then people will see I'm a girl and be more likely to attack us." "I don't think you need to worry about that," scoffed Landon. "Nothing's gonna happen if I'm around. Pride comes before a fall, quoted Vanessa calmly. Landon sobered. Seriously, Vess, he said, I won't let anyone lay a finger on you. I know that, Landon, she replied. But make you sure it doesn't happen to you either. I'll be watching your back anyway. Aw, I'm touched, grinned Landon. Vanessa playfully punched him. He laughed and urged Jin into a gallop, and Vanessa and Lin were forced to race after him. The cloak streamed out behind her, but fortunately the hood stayed on. It was well past sundown and insects were chirping busily on the trees on either side of the road when Landon tugged Jin to a halt. Vanessa trotted past him, then turned to face him. Why did you stop? She asked crossly. Don't think we ought to stop for the night? He asked. No, she said, sounding very irritated. Landon sighed. They were having the same argument they had had the night before. We have to sleep, he insisted. You might not like it, but we have to stop. Why are you in such a rush anyway? Vanessa turned away. I want to see Uncle Kenna, she replied. I haven't seen him since last summer. Landon knew the closeness of the bond Vanessa shared with Kenna. He had seen how she had reacted to his leaving years ago and knew how much she missed him, the man who was like a father to her. He won't thank you for losing sleep so you can see him, he said gently. Vanessa made an angry noise in her throat. Stupid magic. If only I knew how to use it, I could heal our sleeplessness away. But you can't, reminded Landon, so just listen to me and sleep. Fine, said Vanessa grudgingly. Dismounting, she led Lin into the trees by the side of the road and tied her up. Landon followed suit with Jin. Vanessa plunked down on a patch of grass next to Lin, then looked at Landon. You go to sleep. I'll take first watch. They had agreed that each of them would take it in turns to be up all night to make sure they weren't ambushed in the dark and their horses and things stolen. Landon shook his head. You took first watch last night. And you didn't wake me up when it was my turn. But you were sleeping like a baby, protested Vanessa. I didn't want to wake you up. Well, tonight I'll be the one up all night and you'll be sleeping like a baby. That's only fair, Landon added as Vanessa opened her mouth. I can trust you to wake me up at my time, Vanessa. It's really bad for you. You'll get sick again and Kenna and your mother will massacre me. Okay, said Vanessa. Suit yourself. She flopped sideways onto the grass and seemed to fall asleep immediately, for she did not move again. There was only faint starlight glimmering onto the road in the absence of the moon, and even less into the trees where the travelers lay. The faintest rays touched Vanessa's still figure, still covered by that ever-present cloak. The hood, true to its nature, continued to cover her head. A light breeze blew and it shifted back to reveal her face. Landon was struck by the way her cheekbones stood out, the depth her eyes had sunk, and the slight catch in her breathing. She retained all signs of her recent illness, and he knew the healers had done the right thing to send her to the mountains to recuperate, far away from the dust and noise of Lightwood. But sending her virtually alone? He thought furiously. Can't even spare a few magicians as a guard. Morons. A moan interrupted his thoughts. It was Vanessa, and she was shivering like a leaf in the wind. As Landon watched, a great gasp escaped her lips and she whispered, "No. You can't mean that. No. No. Please. Don't say it. Don't." Her voice broke on the last word and she started to sob in her sleep. Landon was horrified. He leaped to his friend's side and gathered her up into his arms. She gulped and unconsciously struck out. "Vess," cried Landon. "No, Vess, don't cry. It's just a dream, just a nightmare. Please don't cry, it's all right." His words had no effect. He shook her, trying to wake her. This did make her pause in her crying, then her head rolled back and her eyes opened. "Vess," grinned Landon, weak with relief, "you scared me. I thought you were Vess." She had made no reply, though her eyes remained open. Landon leaned over to look at them. They stared back at him emptily. "Vanessa?" he said, scared. "Are you still asleep?" No reply. Please wake up, you're seriously scaring me. Her eyes suddenly lit up and she blinked. Landon gasped in relief, then set her down. She stared up at him in confusion. What happened? She mumbled. Nightmare, said Landon. You're okay now? Vanessa nodded as she remembered. Yeah. For a moment her mouth trembled and her eyes glimmered again. Then she controlled herself and looked at Landon. Thanks for waking me up. No prob, said Landon awkwardly. Are you alright then? Yes, said Vanessa, lying back down on the grass. I'm going back to sleep. Sorry if I scared you. And thanks again. And don't look at me like that, she added, catching sight of his worried expression. I am fine now. Don't worry. She closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep. Landon watched the tear tracks on her cheeks glisten in the starlight. Don't worry? She asked the impossible. Reagan took a deep breath. He raised his hand and rapped smartly on Ilia's door. It opened immediately to reveal a guest room filled with magicians. Reagan handed his cloak to Khan, who had opened the door, and shook the rainwater out of his hair. He walked over to the dining table at which Lord Civil and Lady Vanara were speaking in urgent tones. They both looked up eagerly as he approached. Any luck? Asked Vanara. Reagan shook his head. None. We've combed the entire forest and the gardens. We just finished looking through the university passages. There are no cave-ins, so she couldn't have been buried. She's just vanished. The guard has been alerted, said Civil. They hope to have finished searching the inner circle by nightfall. The inner circle? Repeated Valen, coming up. What reason would the girl have for hiding there? What reason would she have for disappearing in the first place? Civil countered. She could be anywhere, so we have to look everywhere. So you're suggesting we comb the whole of Shadoya? Smiled Valen derisively. Civil glared at him. Not the entire country, of course, said Vanara with a sound that might have passed for a snort. But it is possible to search the whole of Lightwood, therefore it will be done. We can focus outside later. We might get the thieves' help, murmured Reagan. A spluttering, choking sound came from his left. Valen stared at him incredulously. The thieves' help? He exclaimed. Have you lost your mind, boy? Reagan pursed his lips. He had always hated being addressed as a child, even when he was one, and he certainly didn't like it now. It didn't help that he was being addressed thus in front of two higher magicians and by his uncle, who was also one of them. Hardly, uncle, he replied testily. I merely stated it, for I knew their help would be invaluable in locating Vanessa, as they're so thorough with the city's secret passages. Reagan had a high regard for the thieves, one of them having saved him from the Aaron 13 years before. It is a good point, Reagan, Civil conceded. Reagan blinked. Praise from Civil was rare, Civil never quite forgiving Reagan for harassing Ilya years ago. Quite, Vanara agreed. Not only that, but they also know the slums well. It would be much easier to find her with a thief guide. I still haven't forgotten the difficulty we had in finding Ilya. Like mother, like daughter, said Valen. Vanessa will probably become a shadow magician too. That is, if she is still alive. What do you mean? Said Civil sharply. Well, said Valen, we have no idea where she is. And most places are highly dangerous for a young girl to be in alone. If we don't find her soon, there's a very real possibility she might be killed. You'd better not mention that to Ilya, commented Pekin, who was passing. She's upset enough as it is. Reagan whirled around, the alchemist's words reminding him why he had come here in the first place. Do you know where she is? He demanded. We're all waiting for her, said Pekin. We are allowed to use her rooms as a meeting place and exchange reports. She still isn't here though. Where was she searching? Asked Reagan urgently. She mentioned something about the library. Reagan didn't wait for him to finish. He rushed off in a swirl of red robes. He found Ilya in the magician's library, shoulders hunched, poring over a network of complex passages and routes. She looked up distractedly as he approached. "Map of the slums," she said. "If we can get some of the novices we might be able to cover them simultaneously." "Not a good plan," said Reagan. "The slums are too big and there's the Thieves' Road to consider." Ilya's eyes lit up. "The Thieves!" she exclaimed. "Wanda will help for sure." "And he can ask the other thieves for help." "Ilya," interrupted Reagan, I don't think you'll find her in Lightwood." Ilya's eyes stared up at him. "You see, the night before she fell ill." "I'm sorry I didn't tell you before. If I had she might not have gone." "Tell me quickly, Reagan," she snapped. He continued, "Well, Vanessa bumped into me. She looked like she was about to cry but I didn't say anything so she ran off. Then when I found her by the spring, it was obvious she had been crying. I thought the two of you had had an argument or something. That wasn't any of my business so I didn't mention it when I brought her back to you." Reagan paused. "So, did you two argue that night?" "No," said Ilya. "I was at a meeting and she was in our apartments reading then something must have happened that made her run away," said Reagan. "But she hasn't taken any clothes so." He was interrupted by a loud gasp from Ilya who clapped a hand to her mouth. "The diary was in that," she whispered. Reagan didn't have a clue to what she meant. Ilya rushed past him and he followed her back to her apartments. She slammed open the door, causing several magicians to jump. She ignored them, sprinting to her library and grabbing two enormous books which Reagan recognized as history texts. Everyone watched in confusion as she tore them open and frantically leafed through the pages. She finished the second apparently without finding what she was looking for. She paled even more in comparison and feverishly rubbed her temple, eyes screwed in concentration. Suddenly they opened and she ran into her daughter's room. The magicians crowded into the doorway as Ilya feverishly looked through the drawers. A few went in to help but, not knowing what to look for, stood awkwardly. Ilya finished with the drawers and started on the wardrobe. Reagan watched a colorful party tunic fly into the air before Ilya drew out a little black book. She stared at it for a moment then, to Reagan's horror, she started to sob. She would have crumpled to the floor in a heap of black robes if he and Civil hadn't leaped forward and caught her. Civil cradled Ilya against him as she cried into his shoulder. Vanara approached them then hesitantly put a hand on Ilya's shoulder. Reagan picked up the book which lay on the floor. It was clearly a diary. Opening it at the place where a piece of paper had been slipped in, he began to read the entry. By the time he had finished he was aghast. Peek in, Vaughn and Unseen who had read over his shoulder were also horrified. They stared down at Ilya, who continued to sob in Civil's arms. No wonder Vanessa ran away, thought Reagan. Poor kid. She's probably better off wherever she is than here. I'd just let her stay there. He stepped around Ilya's quivering form and exited the room. Chapter 3 Vanessa grinned. They had finally reached the forest area surrounding the South Pass. And they had done it without being discovered by magicians. Although it had been 8 days since she had left Lightwood, neither the direction of her flight nor the reason especially could be known since she and Landon would have been captured by now if that were the case. She turned around and looked at Landon. "The trail splits into two further along," she said. "One leads straight to the village." "What are we waiting for then?" asked Landon, sauntering past. Vanessa bit her lip, wondering whether it was time to initiate her plan. Not yet, she told herself and followed him. After 5 minutes walking, they came to where the path forked into two. One led downhill to the village where Kanna worked as a healer. The other, Vanessa knew, led up to the pass where her parents had battled the Aranparka and gained Kanna's help and confidence after their illegal return from Foria. She stopped Lynn and Landon halted too. "What's up?" he asked, confused. "I can go on to the village from here alone," Vanessa said. "Go back to Lightwood, Landon." "What?" he exclaimed. "I'm not leaving you. I came with you to protect you." "And you've done a great job," Vanessa said warmly. "But what can happen between here and the village?" "Okay, suppose you are safe," said Landon grudgingly, "how about going back home?" It'll make a lot of sense if I stay till then. Besides, even these remote mountain places are dangerous, so it's best if I'm around to keep an eye on you." "What do you think Ken is gonna do?" retorted Vanessa. "Sip Page wine while I go and break my neck?" Landon looked disgruntled. "How about coming back then?" he said. "Ken will have to report to Lady Vanara in a few weeks." Vanessa knew this was true. She eagerly awaited the few days every year when her Uncle Kenna swung her onto his shoulders and played around with her like old times. This year, however, she would have to miss it. "I'll go back home when he does. I'll be safe with him. So don't worry, and thanks for bringing me this far." She knew these parting words were all she would say to Landon for a long time, perhaps ever, so she leaned forward in the saddle and kissed his cheek. His eyes widened, his cheeks reddened, and his hands dropped the reins. She felt her own cheeks flush and threw her head back in a laugh to hide it. "Wow," he said. "That was unexpected." "It thanks you," Vanessa says, shifting Lynn around so the path back to Lightwood was clear. She nodded toward it. "You'd better get going before your father gets too worried." "He won't be worried," said Landon breezily. "He'll just give me a bit of rub when I get back. Anyway, I'm not going until I see you settled in here." Vanessa felt a flicker of alarm dart across her face. "You don't have to do that," she said, trying to disguise the sticky moment. "I told you I'd be fine from here." "But Vess," he began, but she glared at him. "Just go, Landon," she said, steering Lynn carefully around so they pointed up to the pass. "I'm telling you, I'm fine. Please go." "No," he said, a trace of worry in his voice now. "I think you're still sick." "You don't sound like I am," Vanessa said forcefully. "Go." Landon glared at her. "No need to be so rude," he said angrily. "And why do you need to see me go so badly?" "I'll be happier knowing you're on your way back," said Vanessa in a quieter voice. "I'll be happier seeing you in that village," he replied. "Come on." Vanessa, hating herself for what she was about to do, rammed the stirrups into Lynn's side. She immediately broke into a gallop, taking Landon completely by surprise. He recovered fast enough to urge Jin into a run after them. Vanessa was confident Jin wouldn't be able to overtake Lynn having come from a long line of champion racers and Jin being just another horse. Nevertheless, she urged Lynn to go faster and so almost missed Landon's yell. She twisted around in the saddle to see Landon dangling from Jin's neck as she ran, his body somehow having come out of the saddle. Jin's hooves pounded dangerously close to his unprotected legs and there was no way he could stop her. "Landon!" screamed Vanessa. She turned Lynn around and grabbed the runaway horse's reins. Landon immediately flung himself up behind her and folded his arms around her, pinning her own by her side. There was a triumphant smile on his face. "You creep!" yelped Vanessa. "I thought you were going to die. You made me come rescue you so you could irk. Let go of me now." "No," Landon replied staunchly. "Not until you tell me why you did that." "I can't," replied Vanessa, turning her face away. "Sure you can," he said. "You don't have much of a choice anyway." Vanessa closed her eyes and willed herself to start crying. She had always had the ability to call on tears and it was going to help her now. She felt her eyes burn as she opened them and looked at Landon. Her vision shimmered as her eyes filled with tears. Landon's expression changed to one of alarm. "Vess?" he whispered, cupping her face in his hands. "Vess, what's wrong?" Vanessa said nothing, just buried her face in his shoulder, tears soaking his shirt freely. He rubbed her back gently as she sobbed. Through her tears Vanessa smiled. "It's a secret," she said. "I just have to do this. I'm sorry for not telling you but I was afraid you'd stop me." Landon looked up at the trail. "Stop you going into Foria?" he said. "I can understand that. But if you were going to ditch me, why did you ask me to come?" "I needed protection at least part of the way," replied Vanessa. "I wasn't going to let you leave Shradoya, but I needed to get as far as Foria safely." "I don't think your mother knows what you're doing this," said Landon. Vanessa shook her head. "But I have to do this, Landon. It's one of those things." "Well, you'll be able to do it faster with me," Landon said. Vanessa jerked back from him. You're not coming with me." "Think again," said Landon easily. "Sakhak is way more dangerous than Shadoya, and you'll need someone around if you fall sick again. And you don't need to tell me what you're doing." "No buts," he added. Vanessa glared at him. Landon grinned and swung himself onto Jin's back. "Come on then," he said. "I hate you," muttered Vanessa, although she was quite touched by his concern for her safety. She turned Lin around yet again. A strong gust of wind rushed along the road and her hood blew off. Landon started at the sight of her short hair. "This journey's a secret, remember?" said Vanessa. "Can't take any chance of being recognized." Landon nodded, still looking at the hair. "I know it looks terrible, doesn't it?" she added. He blinked then shook his head. "No, it looks great." She snorted. "Liar." He protested, but she wouldn't listen to any of it. They rode on for a while more until they reached the crest. Vanessa swallowed as they gazed down on the wasteland on the other side. The horses didn't like it either. Both of them nagged restlessly and tossed their manes. Vanessa turned to Landon. "I'm glad you're with me," she blurted out. He smiled. "No prob." And he led the way into Foria. Night was settling in and spreading like a black blanket over Kura. The high minaret towers with their needle-thin spires loomed up like fingers pointed at the sky. In the shadow of these stood the city gates. Unlike the gates of Lightwood, the Forian capitals were always closed for the night. Shortly before the horn blew to signal the closing of the gates, a pair of riders came up to the western ones. Two of the guards continued to roll dice. The third poked the blunt end of a spear at the rider in front. The boy easily dodged it and led his companion into the city. As they rode on down the street, he looked back and smirked. "That was too easy," he commented to the other rider. She drew back her hood to reveal a pale, hollow-cheeked face with chin-length black hair and sunken eyes that had deep, blue-black rings beneath them. "We're not in the clear yet," Vanessa replied. "We still need to find somewhere to spend the night." "Easy enough," said Landon. "Hey you," he said, maneuvering into the path of a swarthy man carrying a large sack on his back. The man glared up at him. "What?" he snapped. "Any inn hereabouts? At least halfway decent?" Landon inquired. The man glanced at Vanessa and his mouth opened in a leer. She scowled at him. Landon, glaring, moved Jin into the man's line of vision. "Well?" he snapped. The man jerked his head back the way he had come. Straight down. Headless Landon. He gave Vanessa a gap-toothed grin as he stepped around Landon and past her. Vanessa felt frightened but swallowed her fear and started down the road. "Let's go," she said. "Landon?" He was still there, staring at the man's receding back. His hand went to the belt where she knew a dagger was hidden. "What are you doing?" she hissed, batting his arm away. He looked up at her and she was startled to see the cold fury in his eyes. "He was making passes at you," Landon stated. "You think I'm going to take that?" "He didn't even do anything," Vanessa said angrily. "You'll just get us both into the trouble." "Know what might have happened if I hadn't been around?" he shot back. "The least I could do now, Landon," yelped Vanessa. "You can't attack him for something that might have happened." Landon glanced at her from beneath his fringe. "I'm supposed to be protecting you," he said. "How am I doing my job if I let stuff like that happen?" "You got me safely to Kura," said Vanessa. "That isn't doing your job." Landon sighed. "I just don't like you being in those kinds of situations," he said, laying a gentle hand on her arm. "Never mind," Vanessa replied. "Come on already." She led the way down the street, reflecting on Landon's actions. He had always been overprotective, but this he rubbed her arm. Her skin felt warm where he had touched her. They stopped outside the Headless Landon Inn. "Great name, right?" She grinned. Beside her, Landon gulped and rubbed his neck. Vanessa laughed and led the way into a large, shabby room. All the tables were taken and the woman at the bar was refilling mugs as fast as she could. Waitresses darted across the room, carrying trays. Landon walked up to the barmaid. "Excuse me," he said. "Got a couple rooms to spare for me and the young lady here?" The woman barely looked up from the mug she was filling as she answered. "Ain't got any spares. Ask them over there if they don't mind sharing. They got an extra bed in their room." She motioned to a corner where a foreign family sat. Both parents were young and their faces cast into shadow by the effect of the candlelight. The children, a boy and a girl, sat unnaturally still on the wooden bench opposite their parents. They were all tucking into some kind of hard brown bread which Vanessa had never seen before and drinking from pewter tankards. Even from across the room she recognized the distinct tang of race. She didn't want to ask them, it felt wrong, but it was that or sleep on the street. Hesitantly, she approached the table. "Excuse me," she said. The woman looked up. The others continued eating. Vanessa might not have not spoken for all the reaction she got out of them. "My friend and I need a place to stay for tonight," she continued. "We were told that you had a spare bed, but only if it's not too much trouble." "Who's your friend?" asked the woman. Vanessa gestured at Landon, who was still standing by the bar. The woman looked at him then nodded. Feeling relieved, Vanessa thanked the woman and went to sit beside Landon, leaving the family to eat in peace. Landon ordered some of the hard foreign bread and 2 large tankards of rice. Vanessa bit down into one of the chunky brown slices, recognizing the flavor of 10 flour spiced with cream and relishing the flaky, biscuit-like texture. The rice was much thicker and more flavorful than she was used to. It was very filling and made her feel incredibly sleepy. Landon passed some money over to the barmaid. She peered closely at the coins. "You kids from Shadoya?" she asked gruffly. Landon nodded. "That's right." The woman said nothing more but gestured to the foreign family who had finished their meal and were waiting patiently for Vanessa and Landon to join them. They followed the family up to the first floor and into a shabby little room with 2 beds standing on either side of the single narrow window. The woman said something to her husband in a harsh, guttural tongue Vanessa knew must be foreign. He replied in the same language, then turned to Landon and said, "My wife says you are to wait outside with me and while the women change." Landon nodded and followed the man and his son out into the hallway, glancing back at Vanessa over his shoulder. She looked around for a basin of water to wash and then saw the little girl being changed into a nightgown by her mother. The woman looked up at Vanessa and said, "What are you waiting for? Change before they come back, and aren't you going to wash up for the night?" Vanessa asked. The woman stared. "Wash up?" she repeated, as if the term was foreign to her. Vanessa nodded. "If you want to wash, you'll have to go to the well downstairs," the woman said. "That's not safe at this time of night. Wait till tomorrow." Vanessa sighed and glumly nodded. She had been looking forward to a bath after a long week in the wastes, but it was not to be. She changed the coarse work shirt for a nightshirt, then looked at the woman. The latter nodded at one of the beds. "You'll sleep with me and my daughter tonight. The men will have the other bed." Vanessa hid a smile. "Men?" she thought. That description's a bit too broad for Landon. The little girl opened the door and called her father and the boys in. The younglings paused only to kick off their shoes before climbing into bed. Landon looked around in confusion the way Vanessa had earlier. "No water," she mouthed, and was amused by the startled expression that crossed his face. She got into bed and cuddled down beside the little girl. The rake's potency had made her incredibly drowsy. She fell asleep within seconds. Landon woke up to a ray of sunlight falling directly onto his face. Blinking, he stretched out his arms and legs and yawned widely. Turning onto his side, he saw Vanessa's figure curled up under the blanket in the next bed. They were alone in the room. The foreign family must have checked out of the inn early in the morning, as all their things were gone. Landon wondered how silently they must have moved so they wouldn't wake the 2 Cairalians. They were certainly masters not to have woken him, a light sleeper and one who had been trained to react to any situation in a split second. He looked back at his sleeping friend. She looked much younger asleep than she did awake. Her untidy hair spread out over the pillow like a black halo, the shadows beneath her eyes had almost disappeared and her pink lips were parted in a smile that made her look like an angel, albeit a very grubby, dirty one. He reminded himself that he was probably in just as much need of a bath. Swinging himself out of bed, he padded over to Vanessa and shook her shoulder. She groaned and hummed before blearily blinking her eyes open. "Rise and shine," said Landon. Vanessa sat up, rubbing her eyes, and peered around the room. "Where did the others go?" she mumbled. "Seems they've checked out," replied Landon. Vanessa nodded then lay back down. "Oh no, you don't," exclaimed Landon, grabbing and pulling her arm. She moaned and thrashed weakly at him. "You can't go back to sleep, we got work to do." "What work?" grumbled Vanessa. Landon stared at her incredulously. "How am I supposed to know?" he asked. "You're the one who wanted to come to Kura." Vanessa still hadn't told him what they were here to do. He hadn't pressed her for details after she said it was private, knowing it would reveal itself in due course. It was starting to get frustrating though. "What? Oh yeah!" Vanessa cried, startling Landon out of his musing. She leaped out of bed and grabbed a towel from Landon's rack. He had insisted on buying her supplies once they were in Foria since she wouldn't have any otherwise. She had slipped the money back into his pocket at the first opportunity. "The mother told me there's a well downstairs," said Vanessa. "Come on, we haven't had a bath in ages." Landon grabbed his own towel and followed her downstairs. Sure enough, they found a well behind the inn. Several people were simply washing their faces or scrubbing their hair. A girl with a striking resemblance to the barmaid constantly drew up large buckets of water. Landon and Vanessa took two and tipped the contents over themselves. Landon felt exhilarated as the water dripped from him, pooling around his feet in swirls of reddish brown. Vanessa scrubbed her sand-crusted hair with a piece of coconut husks. It removed the dirt effectively in the absence of soap. Wrapping their towels around their shoulders, they made their way back up to their room. Landon changed first and stood outside in the corridor toweling his hair dry while Vanessa had her turn. She came out with her short curls sticking up untidily. The sight brought back a memory which made him laugh. "Your hair used to be that short when you were 8, he said. "Remember what it looked like after we fell into the stream?" Vanessa looked blank. "I pushed you in but you grabbed me so I went in too?" Landon prompted. Her eyes lit up. "My mother nearly had you for dinner that day," she grinned. "Come on, I'm starved," she added as she tugged him toward the stairs. They made quick work of a breakfast consisting of the same hard brown bread and large bowls of green milk. While they ate, they talked. "So," Landon said around a large mouthful of bread, "what are we going to do now that we got here?" Vanessa gulped down some milk before replying. "Well, I'm looking for someone." "Who?" "Anyone who can do the job I have in mind. And we have to get to the dark crystal caves before the equinox." "The what crystal caves?" said Landon. "Why? And what's this job?" Vanessa glanced around. "I'll tell you and the hired person at the same time. It's really secret." "At least tell me what sort of person you're looking for," pleaded Landon. Vanessa shook her head. He scowled at her. At that moment the girl from the well came up. "Anything else you want?" she asked. Vanessa looked at Landon who shook his head. "No thanks," replied Vanessa. "We're leaving now." "Could you get our horses saddled?" "A chestnut mare and a gray one?" "Yeah, sure," drawled the girl, making off past the bar. She said something to the barmaid in which the word mother was discernible. The barmaid said something sharply back. The girl shrugged, then came back to their table and said to Vanessa, "My mother said you have to show which horses are yours to make sure you don't take the wrong ones." "Okay," said Vanessa, rising. To Landon she said, "Pay the bill," putting a fistful of coins on the table. With a practiced hand he slipped them back into her pocket as she passed him. Taking out his own money, he paid the barmaid who came over to collect it. Looking at the coins, the woman suddenly said, "That girl she your wife?" Landon, taken aback by the sudden question, felt the blood rush into his face. "And no," he stammered. The woman nodded. "I thought not. You're a bit too young to be married." "Who is she then?" "A friend," said Landon cautiously. "Why?" "First tell me why you are here," said the barmaid. Landon felt a stab of anger tear her nosiness. "Why should I?" he snapped. "Because it is stupid to have brought her here," the barmaid hissed. "Sakaka is not like Shadoya. Here, the women are never safe. My daughter can't go to the market unless one of the stable boys goes with her. There are thugs everywhere. Your friend might be young, but she is also very beautiful. If you were a man, you might be able to protect her. But you're both just children. You have to go back to Shadoya now." "We can't," said Landon. "We need to do something here first. And I can protect her. I'm a very good fighter. You don't need to worry." Straightening, the woman fixed him with a long, hard stare. "We'll see," she replied, walking back to the bar. At that moment Vanessa's shrill whistle sounded through the doors. Picking up their bags, he went out and mounted Jen. They rode toward the marketplace in a square they had passed the night before. "So now what?" asked Landon. Vanessa relaxed the reins. "I don't know," she said, looking helplessly around. "While we're waiting, let's look around," said Landon, dismounting. Vanessa followed him around as they went from stall to stall, haggling the prices of various items and never buying anything. At least, Landon did. Vanessa just silently followed him. At one point, she lagged a great deal behind to talk to a stallholder, and Landon kept an anxiously watchful eye on her, mindful of the barmaid's warning and the number of men thronging the tiny square. The stall keeper, a large, middle-aged woman, gave Vanessa an odd look as she pointed and spoke. Vanessa ran up to him, face flushed and beaming. "Come on, we have to get to the palace," she said. "The palace?" Landon repeated, bewildered. Vanessa nodded. "Yeah. Near it anyway. We have to hurry." Without further ado she leaped onto Lynn, and Landon and Jin trotted after them. "We need to create a nice, big distraction," said Vanessa as they rode toward the heart of the city. "Something that'll bring the city guards running." Landon smiled. "Sounds like my kind of thing." "Good," said Vanessa. "'Cause this is what I want you to do." "Remind me why I'm dressed like this?" Landon hissed through clenched teeth, cheeks hot with embarrassment. He was attired in a long, flowing yellow garb which Vanessa had borrowed from an unsuspecting merchant, along with a stolen wig with flowers dotting it. Vanessa had wrapped a scarf around the lower half of his face to hide the boyishness of his features, and his mother's very feminine eyes now glared out at the world. "Because you have to distract the guards while I get into the guardhouse," said Vanessa. "And if they're anything like the guards in Lightwood, a flirty girl will definitely get their attention." "But why do I have to do it?" muttered Landon. "You're a real girl and it would make more sense, but I'm the one who knows what we're here for," Vanessa interjected. "And there's no time to explain it all now." "Please, Landon," she said, noticing his disgruntled expression, "I need you to do this. There's no other way." "Fine," mumbled Landon, resigning himself to the worst. "But only 'cause it's you." He glanced at Vanessa. She had purchased a large cap which made her hair frame the shape of her head, making her look like a boy who badly needed a haircut. Although people would be rougher with her, at least no one would take any interest in her. This was the same thing her mother had done when living in Lightwood, before joining the Far Reach, and ensured Landon could be less concerned for Vanessa's safety. Vanessa peeked out of the alleyway in which they were crouching, hidden, a few hundred paces from one of the guardhouse entrances. "There are 3 in the doorway and 2 in the square," she said. "Go." Landon felt her push him forward. He nearly stumbled over the hem of the overlong dress but regained his balance in time. One of the guards nearby turned his head and smiled when he saw Landon. Landon swallowed, hoping the neon red on his cheeks would go unnoticed. He emitted a high-pitched, falsetto giggle and batted his eyelashes at the guard. The man's foolish grin was wiped off his face when a burlier colleague pushed him aside and strode toward the pretty damsel in front of them. Landon wiggled his fingers at the guard, then winked at a third standing behind him. The burly guard glanced sharply behind at his colleague and glared. Stopping in front of Landon, he took Landon's hand and said, "No need to make eyes at Laughlin, doll. He wouldn't know a girl if she stabbed him." His leer widened. "Say, how about you come into the guardhouse and chat with us for a while?" "Well, actually," warbled Landon in a high-pitched squeak, unable to believe that for once he was glad his voice still hadn't cracked, "I think I'd better stay out here." "Why say that, precious?" a fourth guard asked. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Not expecting someone else, are you?" He rested a hand on the back of Landon's neck. Landon barely stopped himself from recoiling. "Of course not," he squealed. "But come on, pretty," said the guard who had been pushed aside by the burly one. "Not much we can do out here. But if we go inside..." He let his voice trail off suggestively. Landon felt sick. "I don't mind," he said, nearly choking on the lie. But a man's shout of "Stop!" and a yelp interrupted him. He peered around the guards as they spun around and saw, to his horror, a guard bigger than all the rest dragging Vanessa toward them by the arm. Her tiny frame next to him made her look like a safely next to a grin. She was kicking and struggling with all her might, trying to dig her heels into the ground with grunts of exertion, fortunately remembering not to squeal. Landon took it all in one glance and cursed. Counting the guards, he saw only 4 clustered around him. Vanessa had told him there were 5 guards around the square, but he had forgotten about it once he had got these 4's attention. And now she was going to pay for it. He couldn't believe he had been so stupid. "Found this little rave trying to sneak into the guardhouse," grunted the guard, shoving Vanessa forward. Landon felt like snapping the man's neck but held his rage in. He knew he had to think fast to get them both out of this mess. "Help!" he cried. The guards and Vanessa looked at him. "So that's where you went?" Landon continued in a jaunty voice. He turned to the guards around him and said, "This is my little brother. He disappeared this morning and I've been looking all over for him. Thank goodness you found him. I've been so worried." He grabbed Vanessa and pulled her into a tight hug. The look of incredulous horror and disgust she gave him was not faked, he knew. "Well, come on, help. We have to go home." "Wait a moment," said the guard who had caught Vanessa. He pointed at her. Why was he trying to get into the guardhouse? "We'll have to detain him for that." "Aw, come on, Ness," said the third guard whom Landon had winked at. "He's this Cuddy's brother. Can't we let him off just for her?" "That's so kind of you," squeaked Landon. "We'd be so grateful. I'm so sorry my brother was a nuisance. See, he's not exactly, well, normal, if you catch my drift." He pointed significantly up at his head. The guards made sympathetic noises and one said, "Tough luck, love." "Yes, it is," sniffed Landon, wiping a few imaginary tears from his eyes. "He's so much trouble and he's not even intelligent enough to realize it." Vanessa shot him a furious look. "And we're orphans, to add to it, so there's no one to help me take care of them." 2 of the guards blew their noses. Landon winked at Vanessa. She looked daggers back at him. "I'm going to get you for this," she mouthed. "Well, thanks again for the help," sang Landon. "Now, it's getting late in help and I really need to get home." He grabbed Vanessa's hand and started to draw them away from the circle of guards. "Hey, wait a second," said the guard who still had his hand in Landon's hair. "You can't leave just like that after all we did for you. Help, you go on ahead. Your sister will catch up with you." He waved a hand at Vanessa who, however, remained frozen to the spot staring wide-eyed at Landon. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his cheek as he stared back. But well, I'd love to but help won't be able to go home without me. He'll end up getting lost or something. Then he can wait outside the guardhouse, shrugged another man. It'll only take about an hour or two, love. Yeah, said the guard holding Landon. His grip on the wig tightened as he placed a hand on Landon's shoulder and gently started to steer him toward the guardhouse. No, really, I'd prefer it if you began, Landon, twisting out of the man's grip. Then he stopped abruptly because he saw the wig only was still clutched in the guard's hand. For a moment he stared at it. So did everyone else. Then, run! Vanessa shrieked and he spun around and ran for his life. The guards gave chase with a collective of roars of rage at seeing that they had been deceived. They ran behind Vanessa and Landon, who desperately tried to keep himself from tripping by holding up the long skirt of his gown. They darted toward one of the many alleyways but came to a jarring stop when a barrier suddenly shimmered into existence at the entrance. Vanessa skidded right into it and fell backwards with a yelp. Landon caught her just before her head hit the hard ground. She gripped his upper arms tightly as he levered her back onto her feet. Her eyes stared wildly back over his shoulder. He turned around and saw a new figure standing among the guards. Though its hair was shorter than Vanessa's, its shape made it evident that it was female. The woman advanced toward them. As she did, the barrier pushed them from behind, forcing them forward, closing the gap between them and the woman. She raised a hand and the barrier speeded up, making them stumble. Landon stared at the magician. Remembering all that Vanessa had told him about Foria, he knew this woman had to be a shadow magician. And he and Vanessa were now considered criminals. If they were not imprisoned, they might become slaves. Slaves normally had latent magical potential. Vanessa's powers had been lost, however. The woman, with her abilities, would probably sense that. Once she did. He grabbed Vanessa and pushed her behind him, his tall, wiry frame completely shielding her small, slender one. "What are you?" she managed to hiss before he pushed her against his back. "Protecting you," he whispered. He could almost sense her rolling her eyes, despite the tenseness of the situation. He smiled in fondness, but it disappeared when they reached the magician. She surveyed their faces smilelessly. Then, when her eyes settled on Landon's dress, the corner of her mouth twitched upward. Landon felt his face redden again. The woman turned to the guards. "Take these two into the guardhouse." They bowed and the man who had captured Vanessa and another one gripped their arms tightly, forcing them apart. "No." Vanessa gasped. "Landon." "Vanessa, don't." He hissed, but she didn't seem to hear, instead struggling fiercely in her captor's grip, kicking, punching and even biting him. "Get this little monster off of me!" he roared as she sank her teeth into his knuckles. Another guard stepped forward and swung his spear butt at Vanessa's temple. She tried desperately to dodge but was too slow and it slammed right into her head. She went limp then, as the guard let go, collapsed. Anger, red-hot and potent, rose up inside Landon. In one fluid move he twisted around, drove his knee into his captor's groin, jabbed the pressure point and flung the unconscious man away from him right into two of his colleagues. In another, he dashed to Vanessa's side and, scooping her up into his arms, sprinted across the square, the dress flaring out wildly around him. This all happened so fast not even the magician had time to react. She recovered in just enough time to create a second barrier in his path. Landon spun around to see barriers at the other exits as well. He glared at everyone in the square. A few guards backed away when they made eye contact. He felt murderous and he knew he looked it. It was surprising none of the guards were wetting their pants. The woman was gazing at him with a new look in her eyes. She was wary of him, but also confident that she could stop him should he try to do the same thing to her. The worst part was, he knew she was right. And if she tried to take Vanessa from him, he knew he wouldn't be able to stop her. He had already failed to protect Vanessa once and as a result she lay unconscious in his arms. If he failed a second time, once again the barrier started to push him forwards. This time he fought it, pressing his back hard against it. The magician scowled. She said something and two of the guards stepped forward. In the same instant Landon glimpsed a streak of red light flying toward him and hitting him, just before all became blackness. He blinked his eyes open. He was lying on his back in a small, bare room. The ceiling above him crisscrossed with rafters overlaid with clay tiles, and the floor on which he lay seemed to be made of hard-pressed earth. The walls were made of granite blocks, the only well-built part of the room. As he moved, he realized he was bound, ropes cutting so tightly into his flesh it burned. He moved his head and saw Vanessa lying beside him. She was bound as well, and still unconscious. Blood oozed from a cut on her lip which he hadn't noticed earlier. Her cap was gone and her hair, slick with sweat, was plastered to the ground. A large, purple bruise was blooming on the place where the guard had struck her. Her face was completely white. He moved, rolling himself across the ground to reach her. He stopped face to face with her still body. "Vess," he hissed. She didn't stir. "Vanessa." No response. A creak of hinges made him look up. A guard stepped into the room. He bent down, a dagger in his hand. Landon tensed as he reached toward Vanessa, but he only cut her bonds. Then he turned to Landon. "No tricks," he warned. Slashing the ropes, he jerked his head toward the doorway. "Follow me." He tried to pick up Vanessa but Landon grabbed her first and held her tight against him. The guard glared at him. "Suit yourself," he growled. He walked out of the room. Landon followed, carrying Vanessa. The guard led them down the corridor to another small room. It was built the same way as the cell but was furnished with a desk and 3 chairs. Behind the desk sat the female magician. The guard bowed before leaving the room. He closed the door behind him. The magician looked up at Landon. Her eyes were large and turned up at the corners. They were the same light gold brown as her skin. Her black hair was thick and cropped down to a sharply defined chin. Her mouth and nose were finely set in a wide-browed face. Though she had the typical features of all the younglings they had seen, something about her set apart from the others. Perhaps it was the air with which she carried herself, a smooth wave of confidence and competency that covered her like a cloak. Maybe it was the obvious fact that she was a magician. She opened her mouth and a low, melodic voice came out of it. "Sit down." Landon obeyed, slowly lowering himself into one of the chairs. Normally he wouldn't have listened, but the woman's voice, full of directness and command, implied she was used to being obeyed. His senses told him crossing her wouldn't be a good idea. Not to mention it would put Vanessa in considerable danger if he wasn't around. The magician glanced at the limp form of the girl in his arms. Her eyes softened. "Put her here," she said. Using magic, she moved the 3rd chair to Landon's side. He carefully deposited Vanessa into it, pillowing her head with a shoulder. She stirred and her lids fluttered. He loosened his grip on her as her eyes opened. She looked up at him, then suddenly her cheeks flashed a brilliant red and she sat bolt upright, jerking herself and the chair away from him. She looked away from him and instead saw the magician. The red receded as quickly as it had come and a sickly white pallor took its place. The magician's amused smile disappeared. "You don't need to look at me like that," she snapped. "I'm not going to eat you." She continued to glare at Vanessa, however, until she sat down. Then the magician spoke again. "Normally, I would treat you two like the pair of thugs you are and throw you in a cell for a few days. But first I want to know why you were trying to get into the guardhouse, since it's not every day I find a boy and a girl pretending to be each other to do that." The corner of her mouth twitched again. She leaned forward. "So tell me." Landon glanced at Vanessa. She swallowed and said, "I wanted to talk to you." The Forian smiled derisively. "Really?" "Yes," said Vanessa defensively. "I need a magician for the job I have in mind and I was told the captain of the guard is one, so I tried to get in." "Well, you didn't have to do all this," said the magician. "You could have just asked to see me. And anyway," she continued, "you're a magician yourself, Vanessa, how do you know my name?" Gasped Vanessa. "Landon called you by it earlier." The Forian looked at him. And I know yours because your little girlfriend screamed it out. She's not my girlfriend, yelled Landon at the same moment that Vanessa vehemently said, he's not my boyfriend. The magician held up her hands. All right, she said. Now wait, said Vanessa. Since you know our names, tell us yours. The magician surveyed her. My name is Nina, she said finally. Landon frowned. The name was familiar. Now, back to my question, why do you need me when Vanessa is already a magician? Because Vanessa halted. Landon looked at her. She was clearly reluctant to say that she was still untrained, since Nina could easily take advantage of the situation. He stepped in, that's our business, he said coldly. The magician's eyes looked at him and seemed to flash gold. He gulped as he remembered what she was and how easily she could snap his neck if she got irritated. Landon, Vanessa said. He turned to see her glaring at him. Shut up, her expression clearly said. He knew it was worried for him that made her look like that, but he still felt hurt. He turned away. Vanessa turned to Nina. I want someone other than myself for this job. And what is this job? Inquired the Forian. Vanessa took a deep breath and said, I want you to bring my father back from the dead. Vanessa irritably slapped at the sap flies buzzing around her head. She brushed a sweat-soaked curl of hair out of her eyes and, shading them with her hand, squinted into the distance. There was no sign of the coast yet, which was not surprising since they were only 3 days out of Kura. But Vanessa couldn't help worrying because the equinox deadline was just 2 days away, and if they progressed at this rate they would not get there in time, though Nina had said it would take only 1 more day. Vanessa glanced ahead at the guide. Nina sat erect in the saddle, the wind picking up her brown scarf and blowing it behind her. Her horse, a great grey brutish creature that snapped at anyone other than his mistress, clopped importantly across the yellow desert sand, leading the way across the wasteland. Vanessa remembered how he had nearly bitten off the crown hairs on Landon's head the morning they had set off. She smiled to herself as she remembered. After her shocking and mad revelation in Nina's office, she had quickly explained the nature of her expedition. After her first astonished reaction, Nina had asked, "And why should I help you with this? What's in it for me?" Vanessa had calmly taken out the bag of gold and shaken it slightly. The coins jingled loudly and Nina's eyes darted toward it. "This is only half full," said Vanessa. "I can give you the rest once we've done this job, but not before. So will you help me?" Nina stared long and hard at Vanessa, who stared back unblinkingly. Then her gaze shifted to Landon, who still looked thoroughly bewildered. As Nina looked at him, he turned to Vanessa and broke the silence by saying, "Why didn't you tell me?" She winced at the hurt and anger in his voice. "I don't know. I was afraid you wouldn't understand." "Vess," he said in a low, even voice. She looked up, fearing an angry glare upon her. Instead his face was blank. "Are you nuts?" he asked, then smiled. Turning to Nina he said, "Well, you gonna help us with this? I know it's crazy, but you know mad people, you just gotta oblige them or they get real strung up." "Hey!" Vanessa exclaimed, punching his shoulder. Nina smiled. "All right, I will. So long as you got plenty of that gold stocked up." "Don't worry about that," said Vanessa, grinning toothfully. Then it faded. "Will you be able to though? Won't you need permission first?" The Forian's eyes flashed at her and Vanessa drew back. "You two just concentrate on getting ready," said Nina heartily. "I'll arrange everything else. Be ready to leave by dawn tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" echoed Vanessa. "Can't we leave today?" "I need time," replied Nina grudgingly. "I have duties. I can just go on vacation when I feel like it. I need to get my employer's say-so." "But don't worry, I will," she added on seeing Vanessa's worried expression. "And do you two have a place to stay?" Vanessa and Landon exchanged glances. We kinda checked out this morning." "Which inn?" asked Nina. "The Headless Landon." Nina snorted, amused. "You'll never be able to get back in. You can stay in my quarters then." "Seriously?" exclaimed Vanessa. "Thanks." Nina raised a hand. "Just make sure you watch your step. The palace is a dangerous place." After Landon's jaw had picked itself back off the floor, they had taken Lin and Jin and followed Nina to the guards' quarters in the palace. Fortunately, Nina's rooms were near the entrance and none of the few people they saw dared to question the captain of the guard. Landon had insisted Vanessa sleep on the couch and a bundle of sheets on the floor had been his bed. The morning had seen them off across the wastelands, stopping twice at towns along the way to the sea near where the dark crystal caves were located. It was at one of these that Landon had gone too close to Nina's horse and nearly been scalped. Vanessa became aware that Nina and Landon had both stopped. She reined in Lin and looked at the small village huddling on one side of the road. It was built mostly of red sandstone, the roofs thatched and a fine coat of yellow dust over everything. A few people standing outside shied away as Nina dismounted. She went up to one of the women and asked something in Foreign. The woman pointed to the center of the knot of houses where there was a little square with a pump in the middle. Nina beckoned to Vanessa and Landon. They all drank from the pump, after which they watered down their horses. As Landon threw a handful of water at Vanessa, Nina said something else to the other woman, but this time she shied away and shook her head. The slightest frown creased Nina's brow and she said something else. The woman, while looking frightened, adamantly shook her head. She said something as well and Nina grudgingly nodded. She turned to Vanessa and Landon. "She says we can stay in her shed for tonight. Come on." "I think I'd prefer sleeping on the ground," Landon muttered under his breath. Vanessa didn't say anything, although she didn't like the idea of sleeping in a shed either. It was her fault they had to in the first place. Night drew in and cloaked the wastelands. The three companions ate some of the Foreign bread while sitting outside the shed, looking up at the stars. Vanessa looked for her birth sign and found it. Right next to it was her mother's. Vanessa's throat tightened. The pang of longing she felt as she looked up at the zodiac changed abruptly into a feeling of anger, so long forgotten but now rekindled. She thought of what she had set out to do. She wasn't doing it for herself, that was for sure. She had never known her father and therefore didn't miss him. Besides, Kenna had been an apt replacement. And judging by what her mother had told her, Kenna was far more fun than Thien. No, it was her mother she was doing this for. Her mother, who had never appreciated her but whom Vanessa continued to love, despite all. She didn't want to love her, not at all. Ilya didn't think of her the same way. And Vanessa was sure, if Thien had lived, he would have received all her mother's love. None of it would be wasted on their daughter. She felt her eyes burn and snorted in disgust at her self-pity. Her anger at her mother continued to smolder, however. Seeking to distract herself, she looked around the sky and her eyes fell upon Landon's zodiac, a beryl. Wanda had certainly named him aptly. She glanced sideways at her friend. He was chewing slowly, gazing up at the stars, a small crease between his eyebrows. Vanessa felt a pang of fondness and affection. Landon was her best friend in the world and never before had she felt it as acutely as now. He had come with her all this way and protected her to the extent of his abilities. Nina had told her how he had fought the guards in Kura. If Nina hadn't been there, it would have been a good time to thank him. But the idea of doing it while someone else was watching made her recoil. Landon suddenly drew in a breath and his eyes widened. "Ezra!" he cried. Vanessa couldn't be sure in the dark, but she saw Nina stiffen. "Ezra!" he cried again. "I knew your name was familiar." "Who's easier?" Vanessa's question stopped short as she remembered. "Oh, right. Your father's lover." "Yeah," said Landon enthusiastically. "I knew Nina's name was familiar but I couldn't remember why until just now. They sound pretty alike. And what do you know about Ezra?" Nina's voice was quiet but there was a hint of steel in it. Landon blinked. "She knew my father years ago, a few months before Vanessa was born. She was a foreign magician who was sent to watch the Iran invasion. She left a few days afterward." "Was your father's name Wayland?" asked Nina. Vanessa and Landon looked at her open-mouthed. Yeah, Landon finally managed. But how do you? Ezra is my sister, said Nina through gritted teeth. Shocked silence surrounded them for several seconds. I never liked Ezra, said Nina abruptly. She was too flighty and immature for anyone's good. She had several relationships. She told me, after her return from Shadoya, about a young man she had met there. He was called Wayland of the Thieves. Nina glanced at Landon. Your father wasn't the first man Ezra beguiled, and definitely not the last. Right now she's living beyond the city with another man. Thanks to her, our master cast me out of the slave group. He said Ezra and I were never to return. Nina's eyes flashed. I never forgave her for that. I went to Kura and I joined the guard. I worked my way up through the ranks till I became captain. I'm still a slave, but with lots of allowances. She lapsed into silence. Landon and Vanessa looked at each other in shock. Okay, Landon mouthed. Vanessa nodded. Shall we go to sleep then? Nina nodded and rose. Vanessa followed but Landon didn't. Go ahead, he told her. I want to stay out here and think a while. Well, hurry, replied Vanessa. We have to be up early tomorrow. Sure, he said. As Vanessa went inside she looked back over her shoulder. He was sitting staring up at the stars. Landon folded his arms around himself in defense against the night cold. He frowned up at the stars, pondering on what he had heard. That his father had fallen prey to such an infidel upset him. But Wayland had been free of Ezra's lure for 13 years now. If she ever tried to make a reappearance in his life, well, Landon would have warned Wanda by then. And Wanda was a level-headed adult now, not the headstrong youth he had been. No, he was still headstrong, which meant Landon shook his head in irritation. He didn't want to think about it. But he kept hearing Nina's voice, she was too flighty and immature. She had several relationships. Ugh. He grunted, getting to his feet. He walked over to his horse. Come on, Jin, he whispered. Time for a ride. Jin nagged in protest but grudgingly stood up and let Landon mount her. He pointed her toward the wastes and she set off at a soundless trot. Whenever his thoughts were in turmoil he did something, usually physical, that took his mind off them. Now he breathed in the night air, free of the dust and pollutants of the city, and sighed with joy at the freedom. They rode on for about half an hour. Though the town had fallen way out of sight long ago, he wasn't worried as wasn't going too far and he could find his way by the stars. Finally, he stopped Jin and dismounted to stretch his legs. After that he sat down on a rock, listening to the sounds of the night. Though apparently an empty wasteland, the Florian countryside was teeming with life. It all sounded out around him now, the busy chirps of insects occasioned with the shrill cry of Moloch. He appreciated them, nights in the city and the slums being filled only with rowdy dollhouse laughter and the trundle of carts on pavements. Through the whir of a navy's wings he heard another unexpected was the noise of hooves. He frowned. Had Vanessa come looking for him? But this wasn't one horse, it was several. And now he could see a light in the distance growing brighter and nearer. In alarm that was quickly smothered by smooth expertise, he mounted Jin. Come on, Lee, get us home, he whispered. Hurry. Jin complied, setting off at a quiet canter. Not quite enough though. A rough voice shouting behind him told him so. He didn't understand the language but he got the tone clearly enough. Throwing caution to the wind, he yelled, Run, Lee. And the gray mare burst into a full-blown gallop. Landon leaned into the wind, urging his horse on. Behind him he could hear several others pursuing him. They were gaining on him. He risked a glance behind and nearly jumped out of his skin when he saw the nearest horse just inches from Jin's rump. Its rider glared malevolently at Landon. He glanced around him and saw two more riders closing in from either side. One of them lifted a wooden slat and struck at his head. He dodged but in doing so moved right into the path of the other rider's club. It collided with his temple and he knew no more. Maybe if we give it a few more minutes, Nina said reassuringly. He can't have gone too far, He's not that stupid. Wait, that's an oxymoron. Something's happened to him. Vanessa practically shrieked. He would have been back else. We have to go look for him. Search the wastelands? Said Nina. That's impossible, you know. And if we spend too much time we won't make the deadline. Vanessa stopped short as she realized what Nina meant. Missing the deadline would mean missing the chance to bring her father back. Then it would be either wait for the next date or return home. At any rate, this trip would have been for nothing. She went cold as she realized the options: continue and leave Landon to whatever fate he had blundered into, or look for him and risk missing the deadline. Even as she considered it, she knew there was only one option. She would never abandon her friend no matter what the consequences. It was out of the question. She turned to Nina. There's no choice. We have to look for him. Suit yourself, said Nina, shrugging. Come on then. She mounted her horse and Vanessa followed suit. They started to follow a trail of hoofprints leading out into the wastes. After about an hour, Nina stopped and scrutinized the ground around her thoroughly. Something happened here, she said. See those hoofprints over there? They're deep, which means Jin must have been standing there for a while. Then these prints. She halted, frowning. Vanessa followed them too. From the looks of the sand, Jin had veered suddenly out of her stationary position and taken off across the sand. Crossing over her tracks were several more sets of hooves. Vanessa shadowed them for a distance and then her heart clenched and her eyes widened. The mysterious riders had evidently closed in on Landon, and at the point where the prints almost collided, part of the sand was flattened out over them, indicating that something heavy had fallen there. A sack or... Shoot, whispered Nina. Not good. Your friend must have met some desert bandits. Looks like they chased him and knocked him out. They must have taken him and Jin with them. What would they want Landon for? Vanessa said in a constricted whisper. Ransom. Slavery. I don't know. They're not magicians, that's all I do know. Should be easy enough to get him back. Vanessa nodded and they trailed the prints, which continued from that point, now joined by several others. Around 50 odd, said Nina abruptly. They should be there. She pointed. They had reached the crest of one mini gorge and were now gazing down on an enormous phalanx of riders. The men were all on their feet and walking around, a few gulping from water skins. The horses, too many to count, grazed on the sparse grass scattered around. Near the center of the group the knot of humans seemed to grow thicker and several more were making their way toward it. As Vanessa and Nina watched, one of the men, obviously the leader from the way the men deferred to him, pulled down a large wriggling bundle from the back of one horse. He pulled down the hood covering the top and a tousled black head with glaring eyes appeared. Landon. Vanessa whispered, starting to rise, but Nina pulled her down. Don't be an idiot, she hissed. You can't just go down there, there's too many. I'll do it. They don't know magic, so I'll be fine. You stay hidden here. No way, Vanessa replied. I want to help get him back. He's my friend and besides, I can fight. That last statement was mostly a lie, though Landon had taught her basic self-defense on several occasions. But like her mother, Vanessa was too passive to be interested in fighting, and she hadn't absorbed any of the lessons, much to Landon's annoyance. She pulled out the knife she had bought in Lightwood. Nina pursed her lips. Stay close by me. Don't fight more than you have to. Vanessa nodded and followed Nina down. Several bandits saw them approaching and alerted the rest with yells that sounded like the yells of buzzards. As the nearest one started toward them, Vanessa clenched her knife tighter and glared fiercely at them. She made eye contact with one. He leered and calmly drew out a glistening sword. Others followed his example until they were almost blinded by the sun reflecting off the thicket of blades. Vanessa swallowed and felt Nina's hand clench her shoulder. One of the bandits said something in Foreign. Nina's reply made them laugh. In angry reply, the magician made a swift movement and several of the bandits went flying into the air. Most were impaled on their comrades' swords and the remaining bandits roared in anger before charging them. Nina calmly put up a barrier and attacked them with force strike. Several of them dodged though, and Vanessa could sense Nina weakening as they continued their onslaught, all the while yelling coarse insults in Forian. "This is bad. I haven't drawn any power in years," Nina muttered. "Then drop the shield," Vanessa advised. "Focus only on attacking." Nina frowned at her then nodded. Vanessa felt the shield go down an instant before they were besieged by bandits. The air was rent with shouts and screams and Vanessa desperately called on what she could remember as she parried away the occasional sword in her direction. Nina threw strong strikes at the men but they did little. Vanessa realized that all this time they had been staying in one spot when Landon was on the other side of the knot of bandits. "Nina!" she called, but the older woman didn't hear as she struggled fiercely against the onslaught of attackers. Vanessa took a deep breath, lowered her head and charged. Almost immediately she dodged a sword aimed at her. The bandit scowled and swung it around at her chest. She jumped backwards just in time. Despite her inexperience, she could tell that this one was an amateur, probably recently joined. As he clumsily tried to stab her, she ducked right under the heavy blade and stuck her knife deep into the man's stomach. The Forian screamed as Vanessa twisted the knife in his gut. The sound was abruptly cut off as Vanessa pushed the knife upward through his body to his heart. He keeled over and lay staring up at her with empty eyes, his blood soaking the sand around him. Vanessa's windpipe contracted painfully. She could not get enough air. She staggered away from the body and looked away. She saw Nina still sending strike after strike into the mass of bandits. For some reason only a few of them were concentrating on her and none seemed to have noticed Vanessa, except the man she had killed. Then Vanessa saw several new figures around the perimeter of the valley, striking the bandits from all sides, drawing their attention. Where they had come from, she had no idea. But their timing was great. With all the bandits occupied, she could get to Landon. She looked at Nina. The woman was fighting fiercely. She was too preoccupied to help Vanessa. So Vanessa would have to get Landon on her own. She took one look at the slain bandit, shuddered and moved forward. Bandits tried to intercept her but to her amazement she managed to parry away all their blows. She dealt one man a swift uppercut which sent blood pouring down his chin. In the same instant his blade nicked her left arm, ripping the sleeve. Vanessa ignored the sting of the cut and continued to fight her way to Landon. The leader of the bandits stepped in front of her. "Don't try anything, girls," he snapped. Vanessa glanced behind him. Two of the bandits' lackeys stood behind him, one holding Landon who was still trussed up and struggling violently. He knocked into his guard and the man angrily drove the toe of his boot hard into Landon's stomach. Landon doubled over with a strangled gasp of pain. The two men laughed. Fury rose like bile in Vanessa's throat. She raised the knife and struck at the bandit leader's chest. Taken by surprise, he raised his sword in just enough time to counter her attack. Sparks flew into both their faces but Vanessa didn't care. With a furious snarl she leaped at the bandit again and again, aiming blows which almost touched him before being parried away. She brought them on so thick and fast he didn't have time to do anything but defend. The other two bandits dropped Landon onto the sand and leaped to their leader's aid. Vanessa turned on them and fought all three with a desperate ferocity she didn't know she possessed. Finally, she got past one of the bandits' defenses and he choked and fell, blood spouting from his neck. Vanessa didn't check her pace and barely felt more than a stirring of horror this time. She didn't have time to think about it as she fought on against the remaining bandits. Angry and fierce she might be, but she was unused to fighting and could feel herself tiring. The bandits could sense it too. They slowly circled her like limes surrounding a robber. Vanessa stumbled backwards as one broke the suspense and leaped at her. She tripped over her own feet and landed on her back in the sand. Her attacker triumphantly aimed his sword point at her. She closed her eyes as he lunged. A choking sound cut off his hood of victory. She felt something heavy slam into the ground with a thud. Opening her eyes, She saw Landon lying on the ground on top of the bandit who had tried to kill her. He had obviously thrown himself at the man just in time to save her life. Now the other bandit, the leader, stood over him with a livid look on his face. He raised his sword, about to cut Landon in half. Vanessa didn't think. She jumped up and darted toward the bandit leader and stuck her knife into the center of his chest. The man's eyes widened in horror and pain before he teetered over. When he landed on his back facing the sky, they were blank. Vanessa scrambled over to the still dazed Landon. With swift strokes she cut his bonds and, as he stretched out his painfully cramped hands and feet with a groan, she gathered him into the circle of her arms. "Vess?" he cried, startled, but she didn't reply or let go. He lay still a second longer, then pulled out of her embrace and regarded her with searching black eyes. She swallowed, feeling a slow blush suffuse her cheeks. "Why on earth did I do that?" She turned away to avoid his gaze and her eyes instead fell upon the bandits' bodies. She let out a choked gasp as the full magnitude of what she had done finally reached her. Landon turned to look at them too. "Did you do that?" he said in a hushed voice. She nodded numbly. "Wow. I wasn't thinking," she mumbled. "I did it 'cause I had to get to you. There was no other way." She could hardly believe that she had done it, yet the evidence was there right in front of her. "But I don't even feel awful," she realized. "Why?" "Because you were prepared to do anything," a voice inside her replied. "Because it was Landon." "You're bleeding," Landon cried, noticing the cut on her arm and bringing her focus back. "So are you," she said, reaching up and wiping away a trickle of blood on his chin. A stifled laugh came from behind them. "How cute. You're such a cute pair of lovebirds." Vanessa and Landon whirled around. Nina stood behind them, hands on hips, grinning broadly at the two of them. Vanessa blushed furiously. As she and Landon rose, she pushed him away from her. "Hey," he said indignantly. Then to Nina, "Not funny." "On the contrary," she replied, still grinning, "very funny." "We're not a couple," Vanessa claimed, cheeks still hot. Nina shrugged, but the smile didn't leave her face as she turned and walked away. Vanessa walked up to Landon and slapped him soundly across his face. "That's for making me so worried, you idiot," she hissed, eyes flaring. Then she stalked off after Nina. The older woman checked her stride to let Vanessa catch up with her. "That was a bit mean, you know," she said. "And you won't catch any guys if you treat them like that." "I don't want to catch any guys," Vanessa retorted. "I just wanted to show stupid idiot. He could have been killed had me so worried." "Well, so are why," said Landon irritably, coming up behind them. "I admit I made a mistake, but there was no need to slap me," he said, glaring at Vanessa. She scowled, then sighed in resignation. "You're right. Sorry." "No rub," he said lightly. Nina smiled. "I've never seen people like you two to fight and make up. It's really sweet." Nina, gross," said Landon, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, drop it," chimed in Vanessa. She glanced at Landon, then blushed and turned away, trying to ignore her heartbeat, which had speeded up considerably in those 2 seconds. She rubbed a hand against her cheek, hoping no one would notice the renewed red on her face. "What is wrong with me?" she wondered. "You're in love," the snide voice from earlier said. "How can I be in love?" she questioned. "I'm too young." But she couldn't think of any other explanation for it. "But what's the point?" she thought. "Landon doesn't love me." The realization saddened her. "Nina," Vessa's hand. She heard Landon exclaim, breaking out of her thoughts. She whirled around just as Landon grabbed her arm and showed it to Nina. The woman winced. "Nasty. But not deep." "I've got water in my flask, I'll clean it," said Landon, and wetting his own scarf and wiping the blood and dust of Vanessa's wound. Vanessa looked away, desperately trying to hide her flaming face and pointedly ignoring the sound of her heart, which thudded against her ribcage like a bird fighting to be free of its cage. Trying to disguise everything, she said to Nina, "Where did those other people go? The ones who were fighting the bandits?" "Oh, those were just illusions," said Nina breezily. It seemed to Vanessa the woman was looking too hard at her, and it was a relief when Landon finally finished cleaning the wound and her excitable heart finally calmed down. "Thanks," she breathed. Then she looked at Nina. "Better go then. Else we won't get there in time." "The caves?" Landon yelped. "I totally forgot about that. I'm so sorry, Vess. Will we?" "We can make it in time," Vanessa cut in sharply. "But let's go." And because she wanted to feel her heart thud again, she grabbed Landon's hand and led them out of there. "Well, here we are. The dark crystal caves," said Nina in a voice that was meant to sound jaunty but didn't quite make it. Chapter 4. Vanessa looked at the yawning black mouth in front of them and gulped. While she hadn't exactly liked the sound of the caves when Nina had described them, she had reasoned that it was manageable and could be dealt with. Now that she was here, she wasn't so sure. She turned around in the saddle and looked up at the sky. The sun was sinking steadily toward the horizon, shrouded in a haze of red. "Better go in," she said, nudging Lynn forward. Landon and Nina followed. Almost immediately they were forced to dismount as the sloping cave ceiling knocked on their heads. "Tie them up near the entrance," said Nina. "They'll be all right." Vanessa extracted the book and the rings from her belongings and pecked Lynn goodbye. She led the way out of the anterior cave into the tunnels beyond. 10 strides in, Nina's globe light showed up a fork branching away in 3 directions. Nina stopped and seemed to freeze, eyes closed and head slightly cocked. Vanessa felt something feather lights around and then brush past her. She realized Nina had sent out a wave of magic to detect the altar's presence, something Vanessa's magician senses had been able to detect. Nina opened her eyes and set off down the left-hand fork. Vanessa and Landon hurried after her, Landon cursing as his head constantly knocked against the outcropping of rocks. They soon came to a place where the passage branched off to the right. Nina took them down this passage. Several times they came to these forks and Nina always unhesitatingly chose the eastmost one. As they progressed on, the tunnels grew more circuitous and wound down deeper into the earth. Vanessa felt the claustrophobia return, but this time much stronger. She felt the panic rising like bile and tried to squash it down. But the awareness of the millions of tons of earth above her head beat it aside and attacked her with a vengeance. She had been dropping back and now she stopped, taking deep breaths in an attempt to calm herself down. The others were getting further ahead and she needed to catch up with them, but her feet had a mind of their own, staying firmly clamped upon the ground. Nina continued on, oblivious, but Landon stopped and turned around. "What's wrong?" he called. "Come on." Vanessa managed a hoarse, "I can't move." Concern clouded Landon's face and he ran back to her. Nina, alerted by the echo of his footfalls, turned around. "Why have you stopped?" she said. "We won't make the deadline." The realization that the sun was almost gone broke through Vanessa's paralysis. She stumbled forward into Landon. "What's wrong?" he said, clasping her upper arms. "I hate confined spaces," she replied. His eyes dawned with realization. "Oh. Come on. I'll help you." He guided her forward, tugging her arms gently. Nina watched them advance with a half-smug, half-exasperated smile. "Well, lovebirds, could you please hurry up? It's only a little further." Vanessa brightened at the news and strode forward more confidently. A little more walking and a tiny passageway opened up into a cavernous hall carved into the rock. Vanessa and Landon's mouths fell open and even Nina seemed to lose her composure. The roof of the cave curved up into a blackness which Nina's bright globe light couldn't penetrate. The tips of stalactites, formed over thousands of years, penetrated out of the gloom. Stalagmites as tall as 3 men rose up thickly from the rock floor like a forest of needles. Vanessa, Landon and Nina wound their way carefully through the spires. Against the far wall of the cave, near the center was a curious, unadorned stone table. It was a waist-high slab of grey rock and seemed to have sprung up from the floor along with all the stalagmites. "That's the altar," said Vanessa, trying to contain her excitement. She knew she was only minutes away from seeing her father. She fumbled inside her pockets for the book and rings. Nina took them. The globe light floated down close to her head as she read the passage in the book. Then she looked up and silently held out her hand to Vanessa. Vanessa took it, knowing what she had to do. She reached inside for her well of power and channeled it out of her body into Nina's arm. Nina closed her eyes and half-consciously held out her other hand toward the altar. Vanessa waited with mounting excitement and bated breath and frowned in puzzlement as nothing happened. She jumped as a hand touched her shoulder. "What's wrong?" Landon whispered. "Didn't it work?" "I don't know," Vanessa whispered back. She looked at Nina. The Forian had opened her eyes and answered Vanessa's questioning look with a shrug. "I don't know what's wrong," she said. "I did a perfect summons," finished a booming voice behind them. Vanessa's body seized up with shock. Landon whirled around, pulling out his dagger with lightning speed. Nina glared into the far corners of the cavern. "What the heck?" she muttered on not seeing anything. "Who's there?" Vanessa called out, in a far bolder voice than what she felt. The voice replied, making her start. "Since you summoned me, you should know." "Who are you?" Nina said, sounding unnerved. The voice chuckled, a deep, throaty rumble that seemed to emanate from the walls around them. "Where are you hiding?" exclaimed Landon. "You can't see me because I don't have a form," came the reply. "Don't have a form? What are you?" spluttered Landon. It was Vanessa who realized what was going on. "Great," she said wryly. "The Praetor of Spirits has a sense of humor." The laugh came again. "Very astute, Vanessa. You know my name?" she said. "Yes, well, I can you just show yourself?" said Landon in an unnaturally high voice. "Please?" Vanessa grinned. Usually it was she who panicked and Landon who thought quickly and got them out of the situation. Now he was completely floored while she felt perfectly at ease, buoyant even. It would be something to tease him about later. "Could you?" she asked. "It would be easier for all of us." "All right," said the Spirit King. "The fun does wear off after a while." As it spoke, part of the air in front of the altar shimmered and coalesced into a small human shape. It solidified into a skinny young boy with overlong hair, dark skin and wearing nothing but a pair of rag trousers. He smiled warmly at them. "Hi," he said in a lilting, childish voice. Hey," said Nina hesitantly. "Are you the Praetor of Spirits?" "Oh no, I'm the Queen of Kronith," said the spirit sarcastically. Vanessa laughed at Nina's expression. "So, Your Majesty, could you help us?" "I have a favor I want to ask. Let me guess, you want me to give back someone's life?" said the spirit. Vanessa nodded. "Whose?" "My father's." "I need a name," said the king. "Lots of spirits in my realm. Take this one whose form I'm wearing for instance. He's one of many urchins I get. There are a lot of fathers as well." "His name is Thien," said Vanessa. "A family Hure, Hauschen. Dalian magician who died 13 years ago in the war between Shadoya and the Forianirn." "Doesn't ring a bell," said the spirit. "I'll call him though." He froze, staring into space. Vanessa, Nina and Landon didn't move until a second haze formed, this time along the floor. It turned into the misty body of a man who lay peacefully asleep. He was attired in black robes and his dark hair was pulled back in a tail. His pale face accentuated the finesse of his features, a strong jawline, a wide brow, straight nose and clearly defined cheekbones. His body was long. If he stood up, he would be more than a head taller than Nina. Several small cuts and bruises adorned his face and hands. "Farther!" cried Vanessa, leaping forward and breaking the silence. She dropped to her knees and reached out to touch the man. Her hand went right through as if it were a cloud. "What?" "That's just his spirit," said the king. "I need material to make a body." "Oh, right," said Vanessa, reaching into her pocket. "Here. These rings were made with his blood. The king took them." "Ah, thank you. Now, the sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" yelped Nina and Landon together. "The book didn't say anything about a sacrifice," exclaimed Vanessa. The spirit tutted. "Books only take you so far. I'm not surprised this wasn't written though. Not many people would be willing to give it a try then." "Why?" stuttered Landon, speaking at last. The king turned to him. "I was wondering when you'd say something. Well, it's simple. If a life is to be given, another life must be given in payment. It's necessary to keep the balance." "So you want a sacrifice?" queried Nina. "Fine then. You can have my horse." Vanessa and Landon looked at her. "What?" "I don't particularly like him. He's got a bad temper. He hates everyone, the only difference to me is he doesn't bite me." "That won't do," said the Spirit King. "A horse's life for another horse is fine. But I need a human's life for this. What's more, it has to be given willingly. A sacrifice, remember?" There was a long, tense silence. Landon and Nina looked uneasily at each other. Vanessa glanced at no one. She turned to the king. "There isn't any other way?" she said in a small voice. The spirit shook his head, looking apologetic. Vanessa closed her eyes. She sighed as different memories came to her. She thought of when she was 5 years old and she had walked in on her mother crying one day. Terrified, she had run to get Civil and he had gently explained to her that it was her father's death anniversary. A few years later, her mother took her to the large graveyard in the woods and laid flowers on a particular gravestone. She had then gathered Vanessa into her arms and said, "He would be so proud if he saw you." Then it was the recent memories again, reading the diary entry and the dark thoughts that had filled her head that night. The plans she had made afterward, the long journey, Nina's involvement of it would have come to nothing. She turned to Landon and gave a small smile. "Too bad we didn't know about this at the beginning, huh?" "Would have saved us a lot of trouble," he agreed. "Shall we go then?" he added. "Home, I mean. There's not much point staying in Foria anymore." "Home," Vanessa echoed, an unpleasant shiver passing through her at the word. "Home," she repeated in her mind. A sarcastic little laugh escaped her lips. Landon and Nina looked at her in alarm. "Oh, I'm fine," she reassured them. "Just wondering I don't think there's much of one for me." "What?" said Landon incredulously. "What are you talking about?" "I'm just..." Vanessa didn't finish, turning to look at her father's spirit. Thien continued to look peacefully asleep. Vanessa thought of how often Ilya had praised Thien and was bitten by a sudden urge to throw her head back and scream. She restrained herself, barely, and turned into a fervor of stormy thinking. She would be so glad to have him back, and she really doesn't love me, that's obvious. "But other people love you," a voice within her contradicted. "Not as much as Ilya should," she thought furiously. "Except maybe Landon." She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. "But what's the point? He loves me like a sister, not the way I love him. That's why he's so overprotective and stuff. I can tell him how I really feel and he's the only one I really care about, the only one who would risk his life for me. There's really not much point to life without him. And I'm tired of all this. I'd have to live with my mother's father. Oh, that's not going to happen." She gave herself a nod and looked at the spirit. "If you want a human sacrifice, I'll be it." "No!" roared Landon. He barreled into her, squashing her down and covering her mouth with his hand before she could say anything more. "Don't listen to her, she's..." as she bit his hand. "Get off me!" she screamed, throwing him off and jumping to her feet. Her hair was sticking up and she was breathing hard. As Nina took a step back, she realized she must look positively deranged. "Ves, what's wrong with you?" Landon whispered from the floor. She looked at him and felt a wave of guilt wash over her as she saw the bruise blooming on his cheek. "I'm sorry," she said, helping him up. Listen to me, Landon, what is wrong with you? He yelled in her face. You want to die? Are you insane, Vess? You can't go around giving your life up. You know what you're doing. I do know, Landon, she replied, feeling a strange sensation, almost an ache, passing through her. It was not entirely unpleasant. I want this. You have no idea how much my mother misses my father. So much she would exchange me for him. It's true, you don't need to look so shocked, she added on noticing Nina's pale, shocked face out of the corner of her eye. She turned to face both Nina and Landon, who was staring at her in mute shock. After I found that out, well, I wasn't sure what to do, but when I found out about this, she gestured to the altar, I knew I had to do it. I wasn't planning to give up my life, but she took a deep breath. If that's what it takes, I mean, I don't see much point in living if nobody loves me. You think mothers are the only ones who can love? Landon hissed. Vess, Silva loves you. And Kenna and Wanda and the entire freaking world if you just give it a chance. I don't care about that, Landon, she replied sadly. All those people could love me to pieces, but it still doesn't. Anyway, she faced the Spirit King. I offer you my life. Please take it and give my father back. In her peripheral vision she saw Landon's face lose all its color and he swayed slightly. Fortunately he didn't faint, and she found the courage to mutter one final word, please. No, Landon whispered hoarsely. He staggered forward and clutched her shoulders. Why are you doing this? Why do you want to die? Because, as I said, my mother doesn't love me, said Vanessa in a dull voice. Landon shook his head in disbelief. It's true, Landon. I read a diary she wrote while she was pregnant, and she said she didn't want me and she'd rather lose me because I'd only be a reminder that father died. Vess, it didn't have to come to this, he said in a strangled voice. She shrugged. It's too late, isn't it? Besides, I might find a better place. She managed a small smile. He didn't return it, only unclasping his hands and taking a step back. A heartfelt sigh drew their attention toward the altar. The Spirit King took a step forward. I know you want this, he said. It's not uncommon for people to choose death in the face of things like this. But, he smiled kindly, I know you haven't completely given up hope on your mother. You know what she wrote isn't completely true and you want to prove it. Vanessa numbly nodded. You've already offered your life and there's no undoing the enchantment. But I can prolong the moment of death until you find some proof of your mother's love. I am sure you will. He stepped back into his former place and cupped his hands around the rings. A second passed and the king suddenly disappeared, much more quickly than he had come. There was shocked intakes of breath from all of them. Then Vanessa pointed at the still form of Fiend which had remained behind. Look. Look. She whispered in ecstasy. Fiend felt as if his limbs were weighted with lead and his head ached the way it always did when he woke up from a nightmare. In those dreams he had often called out futilely as she yet again went to New York. Only it was Ilya now, not his first love. He cried out again in horror as he remembered. And it felt as though he had been suspended beneath the surface of the water and was taking his first gulp of air. Then came the sound of a faraway roaring which he realized was the blood pounding in his ears. Then his nostrils were assailed with the smell of rich, damp earth and the scent of mineral water. Finally, the sense of sight returned and his eyes opened to be greeted by rock needles suspended far above him. He turned his head to the side and saw a woman, a boy and a girl staring at him. The woman was obviously Forian with cropped hair and pretty features. The boy had keen black eyes and a strong-jawed face. The girl. Thien drew in a breath. He couldn't believe his eyes. Ilya? He breathed. The girl came closer and knelt beside him. Thien's exhilaration turned to confusion. The girl was far too young to be Ilya. She was tiny, around 10 or 11. Although she was as beautiful as Ilya, even more so, her eyes were quite different from Ilya's large brown ones. They were wide with amazement as they gazed at him now. Thien wondered if he was seeing things. Ilya? He repeated, completely bewildered. And it didn't help his confusion when the little girl cried, "Farther!" burst into hysterical sobs, and threw her arms around his neck. Landon reined in his horse and twisted around in the saddle. After many days of riding, they had reached the mountain range separating Shdoya from Foria. It had taken surprisingly little time to locate the south pass through which he and Vanessa had entered Foria almost a month ago. But the party that left would be one person more than the one that had come in. Landon glanced at Thien. He was riding a thin excuse for a horse which they had bought in one of the towns they had passed. Despite this, he cut a striking figure on his mount. Landon could see where Vanessa had got her riding skills from. Speaking of Vanessa or someone who was marked for death, she didn't seem too despondent. She had been unusually quiet on the way home, but so had he and Nina. Thien was the only one who spoke regularly, interspersing their journey with questions to Vanessa about the Far Reach, their family and Shdoya's advances since the war. Vanessa had answered them quickly and then lapsed back into silence. Landon had noticed her eyes turned unusually bright during these brooding sessions and wondered what she was thinking. He looked at the reason they had stopped. Nina had dismounted from her evil-tempered horse. "This is where I leave you," she said, smiling a little sadly. Vanessa dismounted too and walked to Nina. The latter fondly brushed back a bit of Vanessa's hair. "Take care," she said for Thien's benefit. Vanessa nodded. "You too." Nina then gathered her into a hug which lasted several minutes. Neither Landon nor Thien spoke, afraid to distill the magic of the moment. When Nina and Vanessa parted, Landon noticed the Forian had wet cheeks. She kissed Vanessa and walked to Landon. "Not too long," he warned as he jumped down. Nina left as she embraced him. It did end much quicker than Vanessa's, though she tousled his hair affectionately as she let go. Thien shook her hand formally. "Thank you for everything. For taking care of the children, especially. It was an honor meeting you, Nina. I am indebted to you for your help." "It was an honor to meet you too, Thien," she replied. "Just take care. I didn't help bring you back for nothing." Thien smiled and nodded. The three of them watched as Nina sprang up onto her horse and rode away down the path. At the corner she turned to wave. Then the wall of rock obscured the rest of the path and she was gone from view. Landon turned his back on Foria with a sigh. He was going to miss it. The endless expanse of sand had been oddly comforting, so far removed from the green fields and dirty cities of Shdoya. Now that they were going home, he could only think of what lay at the end of it. He felt a surge of resentment toward Thien. He was dead. He should have stayed dead, then Vanessa wouldn't urge, "Why did I have given her that stupid book?" The book in question had been burned to ashes after they had come out of the caves, its purpose well served. Its destruction had come too late, in Landon's opinion. "Landon?" Vanessa's voice broke into his thoughts. He started. It was the first time Vanessa had spoken of her own volition on the way back. "Yeah? Did you think Nina could show her emotions like just now?" He chuckled wryly. "Nope. It was unexpected. But not surprising," he added in his thoughts. "Not when she knows she's seeing you for the last time." He glared at Vanessa. She drew back, surprised, then a grim expression covered her face as she realized why. "What is it?" Thien, riding a little in front of Vanessa, turned around and asked. Landon ground his teeth. Vanessa's father had an annoying habit of picking up on their moods. He remembered Ilya once saying that Thien could read a person's surface thoughts without touching them. "Nothing, farther," Vanessa replied, grimacing at Landon. Evidently she shared his feelings about her father's ability. Landon tried to distill the tension. "Race you?" he said, nudging Vanessa. She smiled as she also remembered the day they had raced on their way to Foria. She looked at her father for consent. Thien smiled. "Not all the way to Lightwood." "We won't," promised Vanessa, smiling for what Landon realized was the first time in weeks, before taking off in a cloud of dust. "Hain!" he yelled in surprise and ran after her. Dusk fell sooner than they had expected and Thien had them stop and make camp for the night. Landon huddled as close as he could to Thiene's magical heat globe, bathing in luxury. Vanessa, though with her powers lost, had not been taught yet to marshal them into this kind of form. Nina had been intent on conserving her power and had always made them search for firewood. A good thing as it had turned out, since she had ended up needing every scrap to fight the bandits. But since Thiene had joined their group, it had been cozy nights, not to mention with a powerful guardian watching over them as they slept. He yawned as he accepted some of the Forian bread they still had left and which he was fast getting tired of. "Better go to sleep, was Vanessa's comment. "Ladies first, Vess," he replied, adding with a grin, "literally." She put her tongue out at him, but discreetly. The night wore on for a while with neither of them yielding. Then Vanessa broke the silence. "Father, do you remember anything about well-being in the spirit world?" She finished awkwardly but looked him full in the eye. So did Landon. Thiene looked steadily back at them. "I'm afraid I don't, Vanessa," he replied. She looked crestfallen. "Really? Nothing?" "No," said Thiene. "Everything's a blank. My last memory is of giving all my power to your mother." He fell silent, evidently remembering the final moments of the battle before he had died. Landon couldn't prevent another yawn, an enormous one, and Thiene's attention snapped back to him. "Time to go to sleep, Vanessa, Landon." "Father," Vanessa began to complain but was stifled as he gently pushed her down. "Bed. Now. We can make an early start tomorrow." Vanessa gave in, settling her head on Thiene's lap. Landon grinned at that lying down parallel to the heat globe. "Good night," he said. A similar line from Thiene and a hum from Vanessa were his replies. It took a while for sleep to come. His last sight before his eyes closed was of Thiene tenderly brushing the hair back from a sleeping daughter's forehead, while the heat globe blanketed them both with light. The sky rumbled ominously as the three riders neared Lightwood. Vanessa glanced up and was greeted by the first raindrop splattering onto her face. It lasted only a second before Thiene created a waterproof barrier around them. They passed quickly enough through the slums. The streets were deserted, the dwellers knowing better than to get wet and catch a cold. At one point Vanessa expected Landon to veer away from them and go to his own home in the slums, but he didn't. As she gave him a questioning look, he shook his head. "He's coming to say goodbye," she realized with a jolt. "Poor Landon. He'll miss me. I should have thought this over." It was a few hours after sundown. The North Quarter was still thronged with people, but not so thickly as the rain continued to pelt down. The inner circle again was empty, save a few carriages and guards. Thiene and Lynn both speeded up, eager to get home. Vanessa, Landon and Jin had no option but to rush with them. Thiene came to an abrupt halt when he saw the far reach gates. The barrier wavered and fell away as Vanessa and Landon joined him. "We're home, Father," Vanessa declared, feeling equal parts joy and fear in her heart. Thiene gazed at the far reach for a while longer, then turned. His eyes skimmed past Vanessa to Landon. "Thank you for helping us," he said simply, but Melissa could understand all he meant. She turned to look at Landon too. Up until now she had not looked him full in the face. Now the barrage of emotions on it caused her a physical pain in her chest. There was pain in there, lots of it, but also disbelief and some anger. His teeth clenched down hard on his lip for a moment. "Goodbye then," he said in a tight voice. Vanessa felt a sharp pang of longing. "This is it," she thought. "He'll never see me alive again. I have to tell him, at least now. Even if Father's watching." For how could she live her last few hours knowing she had deceived Landon, her best friend and the only person she had ever loved? But it would be selfish, another part of her claimed. "You're about to leave him, what difference does it make if you tell him now? Apart from cause him more pain, that is." "You're right," she replied. "I won't do that to him." Instead, she looked at him again, gazing for a long time, memorizing every new detail and committing it all to her memory, the lean face, tanned after a month of traveling under the sun. The untidy black hair which badly needed a trim. the uneven fringe with two overlong pieces that fell into his eyes. It was these that concealed the fact that his eyes were glimmering brightly. Landon, she thought, feeling another bolt of pain shoot through her. Suddenly she couldn't bear it anymore. So she leaned forward in the saddle and touched her lips to his cheek. His face beneath her mouth didn't move, but she felt the skin tighten. She drew away to see him gazing at her in shock. His jaw was clenched and, as she continued to look into his eyes, they finally overflowed and he turned away quickly with a barely stifled sob. "Goodbye, Landon," she said, no tears in her own voice but immeasurable sadness instead. He gave an imperceptible nod, then turned his head and rode off into the darkness. Vanessa watched him go, the knot in her own throat getting tighter and tighter. She jumped as Thien touched her shoulder. "What's wrong?" he questioned. Vanessa composed her voice before replying, "Nothing's wrong." "Vanessa," he began, but she turned and treated him to a glare. "I said nothing's wrong." "Then what's this?" he said, catching a stray tear that trickled off her chin. Vanessa stared furiously at the treacherous drop of water. "Farther, I don't want to talk about it, please." "Why are you crying?" he said softly. "Don't be afraid to tell me. You can trust me. You'll find out." With that, Vanessa yanked Lynn's head around and rode into the far reach. There were no stable hands around, so they put the horses away themselves. Vanessa reverently brushed Lynn's mane out of her eyes and kissed her. "Goodbye, Lynn," she whispered, stroking her glossy flank. The great mare swung her head up at Vanessa and seemed to kiss her. The limpid brown eyes fixed on Vanessa's, and they entreated her not to go. "Are you leaving me?" they seemed to say. "Please don't leave me alone." "I'm so sorry, girl," Vanessa murmured, hugging her. "If I could change it I would, but then father would be dead. I don't know." She pulled herself together. "I'll make sure you're taken good care of," she promised as she went out of the stall. Thien was waiting patiently for her. As they started up to the magician's quarters, the downpour suddenly increased. He warmed the interior of the barrier and drew Vanessa to his side. She didn't protest at his arm around her, grateful for the feeling of security it gave. The corridors of the magician's quarters were quite deserted. Vanessa was glad, as it would avoid a scene. She broke free of Thien's grasp and ran the last few feet when she saw her own door. She slammed it open and tumbled inside, breathless with excitement, anticipating her mother's reaction. But the room was empty. Vanessa gazed around in surprise, then went to Ilya's bedroom and hammered on it. "Mama? Mama, are you there?" There was no reply. Vanessa spun around to face her father in puzzlement. "I don't know where she's gone." "Never mind," said Thien. "It will be less of a shock if she finds us here. She'll be back soon. You wash and change, meanwhile." "All right," said Vanessa, turning to go. Her father's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "And Vanessa," he said, leaning in, "thank you for everything. I can tell you how much it means." Vanessa smiled. "I'm glad I could do it." Her father smiled and gathered her into a hug. Vanessa hugged him back. As she was doing so, her eyes glanced over his shoulder at the bookcase. A particular thick-set volume caught her eye. She wondered why it looked so familiar. Then her eyes widened. She recognized the book in which she found the diary. Letting go of Thien, she ran to the bookcase and pulled it down. "What are you doing?" he said in surprise. "Looking for something," she murmured, leafing through it. Not finding the diary there, she glanced desperately along the rows of books. No small, black volume. "But what does it matter, anyway?" the familiar inner voice said. "She must have worked out by now why you left." "That's true," she acknowledged. "It makes no difference anymore. Especially since I've come back." "Do you need help?" Thien asked. "No thanks, I'm fine," Vanessa replied. "I don't need it anymore." Just going to make her explain why she kept it there. "I'm sure she didn't want me to read it." "I'm going to change," she said out loud. "Are you hungry?" "I can know, Vanessa," "That's all right," he replied. "You go and change. Sleep if you want to. I'll call you when your mother comes." "All right," said Vanessa. She went into her room and shut the door behind her. She felt glad to be back in her familiar place, glad to see everything the same. Almost the same. There was a little black book lying on the middle of her pillow. So that's where the diary went, she thought. The sight of it sent a surge of anger coursing through her. This was short-lived and was replaced by a feeling of dullness. No matter what happened, she realized, it could not change what her mother had written about her. "I never finished it," she thought. Probably more of the same stuff. Nevertheless, she threw herself down on her bed and started to read. After the fateful entry there were just one-line entries for several pages, all in the league of, "fainted today." Thana says it's common. Or Kenna suggested walks to work off the cramps. It helped. Finally, there were just 2 more pages left to the end of the diary. Vanessa flipped over to them. "I had my baby girl today," it began. "Her name is Vanessa. Everyone says she's going to look just like me. She's the most beautiful baby I've ever seen. She looks so adorable now, sleeping while I write this. I read my previous long entry before I started on this, the one where I said I would hate my baby when it was born. I can't believe how cruel I was. I could never hate Vanessa. When she was put into my arms this morning, she looked up at me and stopped crying immediately. When I washed the blood off her, she wouldn't let go of my thumb, using it as a sucker. If I put her down, she cried until I picked her up again. There is a definite bond between us already. And I thought I would hate this baby. I love her so much, I'd die if anything happened to her. If I ever had to give up my own life for her, I'd definitely do it. She's worth more to me than I can say. It's impossible to say how much I love her. I only know it's more than I've loved anyone, even Thien. And I know she'll be the same about me. It won't be so hard for me to live without Thien after all because I have Vanessa to live for now." Vanessa's eyes filled with disbelieving, happy tears. So this was what her mother really thought of her. It didn't matter what that other entry said. This cancelled it all out. If she had only continued to the end of the diary, how much heartbreak could have been avoided. "At least I know now," she thought. "She really does love me." The soaring feeling of joy in her chest was so great, it was painful. And the pain was increasing by the second. Vanessa frowned. This had nothing to do with how she felt. She rubbed her solar plexus where the pain was keenest. It suddenly increased to such an extent she doubled up. "What's happening to me?" she thought, and coughed up a mouthful of blood. The exchange of lives. She suddenly realized. The spirit preacher's words came back to her, "You haven't given up hope. You know it isn't true. I can postpone the moment of death until you find some proof of your mother's love." Well, she had, and now the time had come for her to die. "I'm not scared," she thought. "Then again, I've been expecting this." She picked up the diary. One more thing to be done. Amidst coughing up more blood, she wrote in the little space at the bottom of the page, "Please take good care of Lynn." Then she added, "Mama, I love you." She screwed up her face as more coughs racked her body. Staggering up, she made her way to the door and opened it. Thien was on the other side of the room, examining the bookcase. He turned around as the door opened. Vanessa saw his expression change to one of horror as she dribbled more blood down her chin. He rushed forward and caught her as her knees buckled. Her magician's senses felt him trying to heal her and knew there was nothing he could do. As Tavan concluded the meet, Civil sighed. The week's searching had been as fruitless as the rest. It hadn't helped that half the magicians had dropped out of the search. They were all tired of the lack of results. Vanessa and Landon might have vanished into thin air. But he knew the real reason so many had refused to help. The story of Ilya's diary had spread like wildfire. Civil suspected Vaughn of having a hand in most of the rumor-mongering. That didn't stop people listening to him, however. As for Civil himself, he didn't know what to believe. He had questioned Ilya, but she had merely broken down again. He had decided to continue as if everything was normal, but everyone else was too disgusted with Ilya. As she stepped down to walk with him out of the far hall, the others gave them a wide berth. "I don't blame them for that," Ilya muttered. Civil was about to reply when a panicked mental call cut into everyone's consciousness like a knife. "Ilya! Ilya!" Civil felt a vague familiarity with it. "Who is this?" Ilya said. "Thien." The single word made everyone freeze. "Come quickly." "Thien, what, how?" Ilya stammered. "Quickly, Ilya." A mental image reached them. Civil gasped. Vanessa was lying on a couch, her shirt and face covered with blood. Even as he watched, she coughed and some more poured down her chin. "Ilya," he cried, spinning to look at her. But she was already halfway out of the far hall. Civil followed her at a run, as did the other magicians. They still hadn't caught up with Ilya by the time she reached her apartments. Civil stopped in the doorway, staring in horror at Vanessa. Ilya was kneeling beside her, hands on Vanessa's chest and forehead, channeling healing magic into her. Behind Ilya was another black-robed figure. He raised his head and Civil found himself looking into the face of a long-dead High Lord Thien. He didn't have time to ponder this incredible turn of events before he was pushed into the room by the crowd behind. Vanara followed him in and went straight to Ilya's side to heal the unconscious Vanessa. Radar, Varyan, Pekin and Tavan also came in, Tavan motioning to the rest to stay where they were. Vanessa suddenly opened her eyes. "You can't do anything," she croaked. "It won't work. Don't bother," she moaned as her body convulsed. "Baby, hold on," Ilya whispered as stroked Vanessa's head, the other hand still healing. She shot a look at Vanara. "Give her everything." Vanessa gave a weak cry of pain which scared Civil terribly. "Mama, it's no use," she insisted. "I'm dying. I knew it would happen. You can't stop it." "I will," said Ilya forcefully. As she moved both her hands to her daughter's chest, Vanessa somehow caught them. "You can't do anything," she repeated. "Landon will tell you." "A life for a life," she looked at her father, "there's no going back." "I'm going to die." "Vanessa," whispered Ilya, crying. "I read the rest of the diary," Vanessa continued. "I know. You didn't mean it." "I'm so sorry," wept Ilya. "I should never have written that. I understand, Mama," whispered Vanessa. "I left a message. I did it all for you." "Vanessa!" wailed Ilya, breaking down completely. "Vanessa," Thien broke in. His voice was unusually husky. "You did this? You brought me back knowing you would die?" "Yes," Vanessa whispered. "And I'm glad." "I did, Father." She groaned as another spasm shook her. Vanara, her face streaked with tears, made soothing noises and smoothed her brow. "Father, my power," Vanessa gasped. "Take it or it'll combust. Take it quickly." "I can't, Vanessa," he whispered. She gritted her teeth and moaned again. "Please, it hurts, do it quickly, end it," she beseeched him, fixing his own dark eyes on him. Very slowly, without breaking eye contact, Thien reached out and grasped her proffered hand. Vanessa sent her power to him until she was too weak to hold his hand. It dropped from his grasp, her gaze broke and the light in her eyes went out. Ilya gave a kind of gasping scream. She grabbed Vanessa's body and held it to her. Vanara turned away to hide the fresh tears and Thien enfolded Ilya in his arms, his back heaving. Civil took a step back and collided with Radar. The High Lord and all the other magicians were gazing in shock at Vanessa's dead body, more than half with tears in their eyes. Civil closed his own and turned away as behind him the grief-stricken mother's wails sounded out long and loud. Kenna pounded on the door. If Thien wasn't in this time, the door clicked open. Pekin was behind it. "Lord Kenna," he said in some surprise. "Lord Pekin," said Kenna in the same tone. "Might I ask?" But his question was answered as Pekin came out, followed by Vahan, Vanara, Tavani and his own father. "What's going on?" Kenna asked. We've been questioning Landon, Civil replied. We just finished getting the full details of their journey. Kenna peered in and saw Thien, Ilya, Talvon and Radar sitting at a table with Landon. As he watched, all the magicians rose. As an afterthought, Landon did too. Talvon said something and patted his shoulder. The two remaining higher magicians filed out. Civil and Kenna inclined their heads as they passed. Then Civil gave his son a look. Don't do anything rash. I'm not, protested Kenna as his father followed Talvon. Shaking his head, he went in. Landon didn't even raise his head. Normally he would have greeted Kenna straight away, both always having liked each other immensely. But now he just sat dejected in his chair, eyes staring blankly at the wall. Kenna eyed him grimly. One more thing to talk about. Ilya looked at him with a worried expression. But Kenna was looking at Thien, who had a deadened look on his face. I'd like a word with you, said Kenna. Ilya's expression turned fearful. She put her hand on Thien's wrist. He gently shook it off, stood up and nodded. Kenna led them out of the quarters in the direction of the healer's quarters until they reached the familiar spire-like structure. He gestured into the arena and Thien wordlessly walked inside. You wish to talk to me? Yes, said Kenna. I want to ask you a few questions. Like why did you come back from the dead? Kenna, sighed Thien, but Kenna wasn't finished. Why did you have to disrupt everyone's lives? He went on, getting more heated. Why did you have to force your own daughter to sacrifice herself for you? Why did you go into Foria and bring the stupid Iram down on us in the first place? Kenna, It's your fault she's dead. Kenna roared, sending a heat stroke at Thien. He deflected it just in time. It's all your fault, you evil, selfish. He threw another strike. Cowardly, he called Thien a name which shocked even himself. You're the reason that Vanessa is gone. He tried in vain to compose himself. You corrupted Ilya, he said in a low, angry voice. You taught her evil magic and left her to raise your illegitimate child, all on her own. He threw yet another strike. She's the only woman I've ever loved. She was just getting used to the idea of you being dead. I could have, and Vanessa, he moaned. She was like a daughter to me. I loved her and you took her away too. And Landon, he growled, remembering the forlorn figure in the seat upstairs. You caused him so much heartache. Which do you think he'd rather have, you or Vanessa? You're worth nothing. Nobody wants you back. You've ruined everything. I wish you were still dead. The last 4 sentences were each accompanied by a strike. Up until now, Thien had taken Kenna's abuse and attacks without retaliation. Finally, he snapped and sent a stroke in kind. Kenna was drained, having used up all his power in his attacks. So he just stood there as the sunstroke hit him and made him sink to the floor. He made no effort to get up. His injury had finally opened the dam inside him and he wept for Vanessa and all that he had lost. He suddenly felt a pressure on his shoulder and looked up. Thien regarded him with bright eyes. Kenna, he said, you can't hate this more than I do. If I could change it, I would. Believe me, if I could get Vanessa back. His voice trailed off. Kenna looked up into his eyes and knew he spoke the truth. And the realization that Thien didn't deserve what he had just said only made him weep all the more bitterly. After Thien and Kenna left, there was an awkward silence. Finally, Ilya reached out to take Landon's hand, but he moved it out of her reach. There was a time when Ilya was the only person who was allowed to do that. His own mother having died when he was a baby, Ilya had always been the closest thing to a mother he had had. It was she he had come to with Vanessa to get cut dressed, or for a hug and kiss when he was feeling down, or, later, protection from Wanda's anger at his escapades. Now it could be no more. Vanessa told you about the diary, she said. He nodded. I still can't believe you wrote that. I can't either, said Ilya. But Vanessa understood there was another entry after that which ruled over it. She read it before she died. Really? Said Landon. Can I see it? Ilya fetched it for him and he read it through to the messages at the end. Now I understand, he said finally. Thank you. He paused. What's going to happen to Lynn? She'll be taken care of until she's given to someone else, I suppose. I won't let her go to a cruel owner, of course. Ilya, could I have her? Landon asked. Ilya looked at him in surprise. Jin, she's been sick ever since the trip. I guess it was too much for her. She's old, you see. And she and Lynn are good friends. It'll help her recover. And if she doesn't? He ended it with a shrug. Ilya smiled. All right, Landon. I'll make sure she's given to you. Thank you. He turned away to go, but then turned around again and gave Ilya a hug. I'm sorry I couldn't protect her, he said, his voice shaking. Ilya kissed his brow. It wasn't your fault. You did your best. I'm grateful for that. Thank you. He nodded, stepped out of her grasp and walked toward the door. Halfway across the living room floor he stopped and spun around. Ilya, there's something you should know, he said. Vanessa, well, I loved her. I knew that, Landon, replied Ilya without blinking an eyelid. He shook his head. You don't understand. I loved her. The same way you love Thien. That's what I meant, Landon, she said. He blinked. You knew? Ilya nodded. I hoped you would be my son by marriage one day, she said wistfully. But it didn't work out, said Landon sadly. I just wish I had told her while I had the chance. I think she knew, Landon, said Ilya. Landon felt his spirits lift. Really? Yes. And I think he loved you too. He thought about that, then realized it was too fantastic, no more than a vain hope. Nah, she didn't. It was just me. Goodbye, Ilya. He walked out of there, knowing he would never come back. He had no more reason to.